All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special meeting of the Placerville City Council and the Placerville Planning Commission. Will everybody please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. No, I was just commenting that I like this V formation, but it has some kind of like military aspect to me. So I feel like we should all be in uniforms as well. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. But no, thank you all for being here today. It's been a long time coming to have this sort of joint meeting and to talk about the historical standards here in town. And the one thing I've said, I think for a while now, is that we have been consistent. We've been inconsistently consistent, well over a decade, if not longer, at least since I've been on Planning Commission and probably before that and into now, because it's just been, we've never really had a good sense of where, from a policy standpoint, we wanted to really apply these standards. So tonight is that beginning of that discussion. It's not the end. So I didn't want anyone to get the wrong impression that it's sort of a one and done and this is it and we're going to make all of our decisions tonight and that's how things are going to be. So I do think there'll be some direction, but I also know there's going to be more that's going to be brought back. So just so the public knows that. One thing, just from a procedure standpoint, we do have cards in the back tonight. And these are for questions. One thing I really wanted to do is make sure that everyone got their questions in, because there could be some very specific questions that people have in regards to the historical standards, how we apply them, policies, what have you. I want to make sure we have all those so that even if we don't get to every single one, they're cataloged and we can eventually get to them. But also, so I don't know how many people are going to speak tonight, but I wanted to give people some time to speak, but at the same time, I wanted to make sure the questions were in because we might be able to actually get some of that, some of those answered, or at least have a little bit of discussion about them. So please fill out those cards. It's not going to preclude you from speaking, but I do want to make sure that those questions are answered and that we have them on the record. So just wanted to say that. So with that, we'll go ahead and get ready, and we will start with roll call for the City Council.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will take roll for both bodies. We'll start with the City Council. Councilmember Yarbrough. Here. Councilmember Gottberg. Here. Councilmember, excuse me. Councilmember Clarici.
Here.
Vice Mayor No. Here. Mayor Saragosa.
Here.
And for the Planning Commission, Commissioner Smith. Here. Commissioner Lepper. Here. Commissioner Carter.
Here.
Vice Chair Keeney.
Here.
And Chair Friend.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, everybody's here. Any announcements or presentations to the public this evening? Oh, yep, sorry. Any announcements or presentations to the public tonight? Item 3. Any announcements from anybody? Staff, anything?
Just want to mention, as I did just now, if you are speaking, please grab a microphone. We only have a few, but please slide those over so we make sure that it's recorded, is being broadcast, and et cetera, so that everybody can hear when you do that. So thank you.
That is true. These are great new microphones, but they are sensitive, so people do have a hard time hearing it back at home if they're watching on YouTube. So we'll try to all remember that. Okay, then I will move to item 4, which is adoption of the agenda.
I will move the agenda.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Yarbrough. I'm sorry. Tripped me up so soon. Councilmember Yarbrough.
Aye.
Councilmember Gottberg.
Aye.
Councilmember Clarici.
Aye.
Vice Mayor No.
Aye.
Mayor Saragosa.
Aye.
Thank you. And we will move to the Planning Commission for adoption of the agenda.
We do all in favor. Do we need a motion procedurally? Or can we just agree to all in favor? Aye. Opposed?
All right, all in favor, voice vote. Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on to the consent calendar. All matters listed under the consent calendar are considered routine and will be enacted by one motion by roll call unless any member of the council wishes to remove an item for discussion. And we do have one item this evening, item 5.1, which is our consideration of a firework display scheduled for September 3rd. Any questions on the consent calendar for the council? Any, okay, we'll go ahead and open up item 5.1 for any comments from Planning Commission or from the public.
I have a little direction here. Yeah, hi, Ruth Michelson. Maybe this is about consent item about those fireworks. Maybe I missed something in reading it, which would be great if I did, because I just didn't really understand why we're having another fireworks, you know? It's upsetting to a lot of animals and people who have PTSD and all of that. So was it in the staff report and I just didn't clearly read who's sponsoring it and why it came forward? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close public comment, bring it back to the council. Pierre, did you have I don't know if you wanted to give a quick staff report on this item, just to clarify the question.
Is staff's understanding that it's a Labor Day fireworks display? It's being put on by, I don't have the staff report in front of me, but we actually list who the pyrotechnics is. It's basically hosted by the El Dorado County Fairgrounds, so that's where it's going to be held. They've received they are a permitted pyrotechnics company. So we received a letter from the El Dorado County Fire Protection District that they meet all the minimum requirements to conduct a fireworks display on that Sunday. I don't have anything else to add. Answer any questions anybody may have.
I believe that this is in association with the racetrack, and it's a Labor Day thing, as was said, very, very Yankee Doodle, actually. So, but it's the racetracks.
If I could add to that too, and Tim Cordero's here if you have questions for the fire district, but it's my understanding that it's going to be a short burst of fireworks at the beginning of one of the races and a short burst at the end. So it's not a full show, it's just a very short burst of fireworks at those two time periods. So.
All right, thank you for those clarifications from staff. Is there any other questions from council on this item? All right, then I will entertain a motion.
I'll move consent.
I'll second.
All right, we have a first and a second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Clarici?
Aye.
Councilmember Yarbrough?
Aye.
Councilmember Gottberg?
Aye.
Vice Mayor No?
Aye.
Mayor Saragosa?
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to item 6, which is our discussion and action items, why we're all here this evening. And that's item 6.1, which is our joint City Council and Planning Commission Historic Preservation Workshop facilitated by Ecor Consulting. And Pierre, if you want to kick this off for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Saragosa and members of the City Council, and thank you, Chair Friend and members of the Planning Commission. Just on behalf of staff, we really appreciate the time you're taking to have this special workshop. Staff many times does we find ourselves in the crosshairs between the applicants and our regulations, and I think from staff's perspective, it's really important to us to have a firm commitment from the decision makers on what position the city needs to take with respect to historic preservation of its historic resources. So let me just start by saying the purpose. What's the purpose of the workshop? It's basically to assist the city council members and the planning commissioners with a greater understanding of the costs and benefits of the application and implementation of the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation and guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings that the city imposes on renovation projects on buildings within the city's historic districts. So to place in context, the city has historically placed great value in its historic past, is evident by its slogan, the city seal, its general plan policies, its zoning regulations, and the creation of historic districts. And we have 4 residential historic districts. The city's general plan contains a goal G, and that's within its natural, cultural, and scenic resources element of its general plan. And it states to preserve and enhance Placerville's historical heritage. The following are some of the policies that are more relevant to the preservation of historic neighborhoods and buildings, and I'll read the 2 important ones. There's actually a number of them. Policy 1 states that the city shall set a high priority on the protection and enhancement of the Placerville's historically and architecturally significant buildings and sites. And then number 3, the city shall prepare, maintain, and regularly update an inventory of buildings, sites, cemeteries, parks, and other artifacts and historical and architectural significance. So the general plan policies are implemented through the adoption of or various ordinances. We have Ordinance 1474, that was adopted in January of 1991, which added zoning code section 10-4-10, which required design review of historic buildings in the city, which includes those buildings located in any of the 4 residential historic districts. And any other historic buildings that are so designated by the city would also be included. So section 10-410B was revised in January of 2011, replacing the California Historical Advisory Committee's statement of policy as a review criteria, and it was replaced with the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation because the state guidelines became obsolete. On October 20th of 2012, a joint workshop was held by the City Council, the Planning Commission, and the then Historic Advisory Committee to discuss the city's development guide, the zoning ordinance with regards to historic preservation, and the Secretary of Interior standards. At that time, following that workshop, no action was taken. However, it was agreed by consensus that the development guide be updated and be more user-friendly. So a comprehensive update was approved by the City Council on June 28th of 2016. City also held a workshop, and hopefully somebody can help me with this. I believe it was 5 or so years ago here at Town Hall, and that workshop was a public workshop, and it was provided by the State Office of Historic Preservation staff. So staff is recommending that the council and the Planning Commission receive a presentation from E-Corp Consulting, conduct a joint City Council Planning Commission workshop to engage in a discussion of the city's application of the Secretary of Interior standards and provide any further direction to staff. So with that, staff is pleased to introduce Nathan Hallam. He is a senior architectural historian with E-Corp's Rockland office. He has 17 years experience in historic preservation, cultural resource management, and academic teaching and scholarship in California, Arizona, and Idaho. He specializes in conducting archival research, preparing historic contexts, managing field surveys, and using the National Register criteria to evaluate historic properties under CEQA and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Before he joined E-Corp, he administered the North Central Information Center, which is a repository of cultural resources, documentation at California State University in Sacramento. At CSU Sacramento, he also taught courses in history, Sacramento history, Western U.S. history, and historic preservation. He meets the Secretary of Interior Standards professional qualifications for standards for history, architectural history, and historic preservation. Professor Hallam holds a bachelor's degree in history from Sonoma State University, a master's degree in history from Cal State Sacramento, and a PhD in history from Arizona State University. So at this point, unless council or commission has any questions, I will turn the workshop over to Professor Hallam, who will provide a presentation and facilitate hopefully a very meaningful workshop between the council and the commission. With that, welcome Professor Hollum.
Is this on? We good? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Mayor and Council, members of the Planning Commission and staff, particularly Pierre and Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the invitation. I don't know if I need to click anything to get the presentation going. The next button? Not yet. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I might stand, so I'll hold this. I'm not like much of a performer, but I'll try and hold the microphone. A brief. I tell you what, maybe I'll stand up at the front, so I don't have my back to the public. A brief outline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is historic preservation and brief history of the movement. Discuss its value. Provide a little bit of background on Placerville's historic preservation activities. I know Pierre mentioned some of them. Hopefully everything will rhyme. I'm not from here, so if I have any of my facts not straight, please just speak up, and we're happy to get the Placerville story correct. And then we'll dive into a discussion of the Secretary of the Interior standards. What goes along with that is 7 aspects of integrity. So a property can have significance, it could be very historic, but if it doesn't look right, if it doesn't have integrity, historic integrity, it could have structural integrity, but it needs historic integrity as well. We'll discuss what those 7 aspects are. I looked at Grass Valley and their program as just an example of another foothills town that has been building their preservation program. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a good model for some recent work that's been done in sort of a comparable city, sort of nearby, and then some other emerging trends we can talk about. But I want to emphasize the Secretary of Interior standards, because I know that's a big part of what staff has been working with, and we'll open it up to Q&A afterwards. If you want to just jump in and ask a quick question, that's perfectly fine. Any questions before we get started? Okay. So what is historic preservation? I've got 3 or 4 different ideas. This is from the National Park Service. Historic preservation is a conversation with our past about our future. It provides us with opportunities to ask what is important in our history and what parts of our past can we preserve for the future. Through historic preservation, we look at history in different ways, ask different questions of the past, and learn new things about our history and ourselves. Historic preservation is an important way for us to transmit our understanding of the past to future generations. So asking questions, transmitting information about the past to future generations, that's the National Park Service. The Division of the State Architect at DGS at the state of California has a different perspective. Historic preservation affirms environmental sensitivity. So historic preservation as environmentalism. Just think of the many railroad tank cars full of fuel required to bake for a full week, the countless bricks that make up a vintage building. How much more respectful of our earth and its resources to conserve that huge investment in non-renewable fuel rather than to consign it, along with all the labor and all those materials, to a non-biodegradable heap of landfills. So historic preservation as smart environmental policy. Ed Glazer, Triumph of the City, he writes out of New York City. Historic preservation is the urban equivalent of those restrictive suburbanites who want to mandate 5-acre lot sizes in order to keep out the riffraff. So he's irritated with historic 12-story apartment buildings built in the 1920s in Manhattan, because you can't fit many people in a 12-story. Why not tear it down and build a 112-story building where so many more people can move to New York and move to New York and enjoy the city? He's irritated with preservation for those reasons. Another perspective: historic preservation is a tool used by planners to shape cities, towns, and rural landscapes. Preservation enjoys grassroots support, hopefully, from residents who favor repurposing, not demolishing older buildings and structures. Historic preservation involves sensitive adaptations of older buildings and structures for modern uses. It creates visually and temporally complex downtowns and neighborhoods and reinforces a sense of local distinctiveness moving forward. and we'll move forward. So, speaking of local distinctiveness, this is just a Google Street View image, so very neutral, very public, you're all familiar with this, of course. I am showing this to show you an image of a place that I feel is quite distinctive. You know exactly where in the world you are when you're standing here. There's no other town that this could possibly be. It has multiple layers of meaning. The architecture is a big part of that. And it's a wonderful streetscape that is an excellent example of downtown historic preservation. 500 feet to the north is another street view that you're all familiar with. It probably doesn't have quite as much meaning that we can assign to it. It's a great place to get from A to B really quickly if there's no traffic, which might be the middle of the night, but it's a place that might not qualify as quite such a meaningful place as the previous image. The geographer Yi Futuan is a Chinese geographer, gives us a simple but memorable formula for what is a place. And a place is geographic space times meaning. Space times meaning equals place. The more meaning we have, or the thicker meaning appears to be, the thicker the sense of place that we get when we're in a place like this versus a place like this, perhaps. I don't mean to disparage the freeway, but it's probably not as visually interesting. It doesn't give you a sense of time and a sense of place like Main Street, Placerville. Another example, John Pearson's Soda Works building. You know exactly where you are in the world when you're looking at this building. It's on the National Register. It is sort of, in some ways, embodies Placerville. Not only does it say Placerville Soda Works, but it's built with locally quarried stones. It is the lower level, at least, I think, from the 1850s, and then the upper level from the later 19th century. Again, you know exactly where you are. This is Placerville, in a sense. The building next door, it's a fine building. It was the title company for a number of years. I think it might be a dentist office now. It's actually 50 years old this year. It's 1973. I had to look it up. So we would have to evaluate this under Section 106 if it was going to be affected by a federal project. We would have to determine whether or not it's eligible for the National Register because it's 50 years old now. It's a good building. It perhaps does not communicate anything essential about Placerville like the soda shop. Agree? Disagree? Although it's old, perhaps it doesn't have those layer of meanings that might be assigned to the Soda Works building. So what does this have to do with preservation? Before I get into this, so I might add that generally people want to live in a place that is thick with meaning, that you can get a sense of the past and a sense of time, as opposed to abstract space. I lived in Chandler, Arizona for a little bit. It was just miles and miles of 3-bedroom, 2-bath, stick and stucco houses with red tile roofs. They all looked the same, and it just went forever. And you could wake up in the morning and you didn't really know exactly where you were in the world because it just didn't really communicate much about Arizona at the time. Those are great places to live and raise a family, but what a lot of people want, I don't think you have to be a realtor to notice that places that have a sense of place that's very immediate are desirable. And so this is probably why we have folks that are wanting to move to Placerville. If they are all of a sudden able to work from home and can live anywhere, they're choosing older communities with a strong sense of place and a commitment to historic preservation, because you can't have those old buildings without a preservation program of some sort, generally, unless you get lucky. A brief history of the historic preservation movement. This will be real brief, but I have identified two purposes for, two rationales for historic preservation over the years. One is preserving places that matter, that are threatened by development or deterioration. So sort of the emotional reasons for preservation, because we don't want to lose it, because it says something about us that we want to maintain for future generations. So a couple examples through history. Independence Hall on the bottom left in Philadelphia. 1816, a developer wanted to tear down Independence Hall in 1816 and build the old city of Philadelphia out in its footprint. The city of Philadelphia bought the property and restored it and continued to preserve it. It's administered by the National Park Service now. Mount Vernon in 1858 was a nonprofit group, the Ladies of Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon Ladies Association bought the property, received donations, and were able to fix it up, and they still administer it. The Old South Meeting House in Boston, the site of the Boston Tea Party, it was in 1876, a bunch of artists and writers. I think Emerson and others were involved in building up support for a nonprofit New England Preservation to acquire the property and restore it and make sure it didn't get torn down. The 1906 Antiquities Act, the President of the United States can declare a national monument, still can, still does. Originally that was to protect southwestern archaeological ruins. That's Wupatki National Monument in northern Arizona. They were being looted. People would sort of wander in and look for artifacts, and they would end up at curio shops in Phoenix and Tucson. So to protect those archaeological sites, Colonial Williamsburg, it was Rockefeller who bought the old town and restored it and rebuilt it to look and feel like a colonial town in Virginia. And then, of course, the California missions in 1920 corresponded with the development of Highway 1 and those mission bells that were built along the side of the highway, but groups went in and provided for the preservation of the 20-some-odd California missions. So preserving places that hold special significance in regional and national development. The 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, which is where we get Section 106 from, it's where we get the National Register of Historic Places from. This is kind of in line with this sort of doing the right thing. And it was because the freeway builders, the highway departments in every state in the country were sort of just clear-cutting the forest of old buildings to build their freeways through town, and in rural landscapes as well. And urban renewal, so the redevelopment agencies knocking down what they called slums. In many cases, historic properties that went back to the mid-19th century in Sacramento even. And the public sort of woke up to what was going on, and there was this sort of groundswell of support for a Historic Preservation Act to prevent federal agencies from knocking down buildings. It doesn't do much for private property owners, doesn't do much for local historic saving buildings at the local level. That's what preservation ordinances in cities like Placerville are for. The Preservation Act prevents the federal government from tearing down old buildings, although they often do. So the other purpose is making cities and towns more desirable for residents and visitors. Through time, we see preservation embraced as kind of a tourism strategy. That begins in the 1920s. A few examples. Santa Fe, 1910. Turns out Santa Fe, that was the territorial capital of New Mexico, was bypassed by the railroad. It went from Albuquerque up to Las Vegas, New Mexico. And that was bad if you were a city in 1900, 1910 to not have the railroad. So city leaders began encouraging new construction based on local building traditions like the Pueblo tradition, territorial tradition, to attract tourists. And it worked. Santa Fe's a wonderful place to visit. The historical zoning ordinance in 1957 actually enforced you can't build anything in Santa Fe if it doesn't conform to these architectural traditions. And it's still in place. Santa Barbara in 1925, people may forget there was a big earthquake in Santa Barbara in 1925, and it destroyed most of the town. Santa Barbara just kind of looked like any old late 19th century American town. Nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't architecturally distinctive. The Architectural Board of Review and the Plans and Planting Committee required builders to rebuild the town after the earthquake with the Spanish colonial architecture that you see. On the left in Santa Fe, that's La Fonda on the Plaza, 1922. The Santa Barbara County Courthouse, 1929. And then Charleston, a similar story. Charleston was a very significant colonial American city on the Atlantic seaboard. Remained significant through the antebellum period. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, they were literally reconstructing the South along the lines of railroads, and Charleston, like Santa Fe, didn't get a railroad soon enough, so all the money went to Atlanta, which was the big railroad town. In the 30s, they sort of turned to tourism and preservation as a way to sort of rebuild their local economy. So doing the right thing and then also creating desirability in your community are the two reasons for preservation that we see over the years. So again, correct me if I get any of this wrong. I went online and tried to piece together a little timeline of Placerville's preservation history. But 1980, we find the City Council establishing the Historic Advisory Council, which sort of comes and goes over the years. 1981, the residential historic districts are created. 1984 and 85, it's a grant from Department of Parks and Recreation that allows a consultant to come in and survey those 4 districts, and maybe parts of the other parts of the town as well, and distinguishes contributors in the historic districts from non-contributors. And then, I suppose based on that work, in the 80s and 90s, City Council designates 10 historic sites that are outside of the residential districts. Sound right? 2011, City Council, Pierre mentioned this history, reestablishes the Historic Advisory Council. 2015, those duties get reassigned to the Planning Commission, as you well know. Any questions? A look at the 4 residential historic districts. You're all familiar with these, but for the public, we find them 2 on the north side of downtown and 2 on the south side. So I'm not going to read the whole code, but just some highlights that I teased out of the code. Title 10, Chapter 4, so the site plan review section. Any owner making any alterations on the exterior of a historical building shall first secure approval from the Planning Commission. Buildings within a historical district shall not be demolished unless approved by the Planning Commission. And then Section 10, the section on historic preservation. The City of Placerville seeks the protection, Pierre may have read this earlier, the protection, enhancement, and perpetuation of the old and historical buildings in historical districts of the city and the perpetuation of historic type architecture within historical districts which have special historical and aesthetic interest and value. Historical criteria. We use the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And then construction and repairs, conformity required. All buildings constructed or altered within the historical districts shall, as to their exterior architecture visible from the street, conform to the historical criteria, which is, of course, the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. There's 3 other standards, but rehabilitation is sort of the one that gets used the most. It is derived from the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act. The act requires, among other things, that the federal government establish professional standards for the preservation of historic properties. They don't get right to it. Like a lot of things in government, it takes a crisis before they get around to creating the standards. That comes 8 years later when HUD, the HUD Act of '74 and the Emergency Home Purchase Assistance Act are enacted, and these programs are administered by HUD. They provide block grants for community revitalization and loans to homeowners to rehabilitate old buildings listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register. So we're going to give people money to rehabilitate their old buildings, but we don't exactly know what rehabilitation really means. So they get right to work. 2 years later, they issue, National Park Service issues guidelines for rehabilitating old buildings as sort of preliminary guidance. It involves the checklist for the application of the guidelines and the consider versus avoid format that you might all be familiar with and that still exists in the Secretary of Interior standards. Major revisions over the years take us to 2017, which is the most recent version. So what are the Secretary of the Interior standards? There is, it's a dense book, and there's a lot of nuance to it. For the public and for you all, I have just sort of hit on the overview, which involves 10 points. We'll go through them. Number 1, a property will be used as it was historically or be given a new use that requires minimal change to its distinctive materials, features, spaces, and spatial relationships. So we're going to minimize change. as a preservation principle for rehabilitation. Number 2, the historic character of a property will be retained and preserved. The removal of distinctive materials or alterations of features, spaces, and spatial relationships that characterize a property will be avoided. So we're not going to remove character-defining features or those architectural features that make a property historic, if possible. Each property will be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or elements from other historic properties, will not be undertaken. So you shouldn't add on to your property in a way that makes it look like the addition is historic. If the house is built in 1920 and you've got a pretty good sense of what 1920 architecture and construction methods involved, and you can just sort of build an addition that looks perfect and it looks like it had always been there, the Secretary of Interior Standards don't want you to do that. You can build an addition if you get the building permit, but it has to, we might read this in a minute, but it needs to basically conform to the property in a way that doesn't detract from the significance of the original property, but it should also look like it's from 2023 to some extent. Changes to a property that have acquired historic significance in their own right will be retained and preserved. So if you've got an 1860 house and your residential historic district's period of significance is 1860 to 1940, if there was an addition to that house made in 1930, sort of at the tail end of the period of significance, we should preserve that as well because it falls within that 80-year period of significance for the district. Distinctive materials, features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property will be preserved, going back to those character-defining features. So there's just a lot of words here that kind of in some ways say the same thing over and over again. It's a dense document, as it should be. 6, deteriorated historic features will be repaired rather than replaced. That can be difficult to find a person with the skills to repair rather than replace. So these are rigorous. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old in design, color, texture, and where possible materials. So if something in your old house needs to be replaced, it's just no longer usable, please take pictures of what's being replaced so you can match it. It's called an in-kind replacement. You can match it with the materials and design that look as close to the original as possible, which can be hard to do. Replacement of missing features will be substantiated by documentary and physical evidence. So hopefully you have good pictures or perhaps drawings. Chemical or physical treatments, if appropriate, will be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. So if you have a masonry building that's painted, don't sandblast the paint off. Find some other way to retexture your property. Archaeological resources will be protected and preserved in place. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures will be undertaken. New additions, that almost never comes up in a residential district, but it could. New additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. So like an ADU. If you're going to build an ADU in the back of your historic property, it should not diminish what makes the main property eligible as a contributor to the historic district in the first place. The new work will be differentiated from the old, so it shouldn't look like
I
the
just
old.
want to make a point right there because I think this has been one of the things that I believe we've gotten wrong over a long period of time, where we've always tried to sandwich in something that looks exactly as it should, as opposed to something that looks different, because it's not supposed to adhere to, it's not supposed to look exactly like something that was built in 1889. And so it's just something I really want people to take in, because, you know, people might say it's ugly, it doesn't look right, but the whole point is that it's not supposed to look like it was built in 1889 if you're building something in 2023. So just a point of clarification. If you're using yes.
And so what I'll get to later is there's all kinds of opportunity to develop your own standards for the city, and it's all of its residential historic districts, or standards tailored to each specific district, depending on the level of effort that you want to make. but we'll get to that in a minute. Finally, new additions and adjacent or related new construction will be undertaken in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. So don't swap the window out if you're worried about security. Maybe put like a gate in front of the window that could be removed, just sort of making that up. But find solutions that are removable in the future, if possible. Any questions? And that's about a 200-page standards that gets pretty, can be hard to navigate through sometimes. I wanted to address the 7 aspects of integrity. We use these all the time when we're evaluating properties for their eligibility individually for the National Register. Something can be significant. It can be associated with an important person. It can be associated with an event that shaped a community. It can be just an architectural marvel that's just a one-of-a-kind example of mission revival in your town. But if it doesn't have adequate integrity, it cannot be eligible for the National Register. Same with a contributor in a residential historic district. In order to be a contributor, it has to meet not necessarily every aspect of integrity, but it can't have, I've always heard a rule of 3 strikes and you're out. If you got 3 big integrity violations, you might be out as a contributor to a district. But again, it's up to each local government, local jurisdiction to decide what their threshold is for a contributor becoming a non-contributor. Location, so the place has to be located where it was originally constructed or where it was moved to within the period of significance. Setting, if it's in a 1920s suburban setting and that 1920s suburban setting becomes sort of commercial, it becomes, there's office towers going up all over the place, it might lose its integrity of setting. The 3 we want to pay attention to: design, materials, and workmanship. Does it convey the aspects of its construction that make it significant architecturally? So does it have the same design? Does it show the same building materials? Does it show the work that went into building the property that made it significant as a historic house? Feeling and association are a little bit more subjective. If you were to step back into time, if it's a 1920 house, if you were to step back, if you were to bring someone from 1920 into the present, have them look at the house and say, is this how you remember this house? Does this look right? If they were to say yes, then you probably have your integrity of feeling intact. If they wouldn't recognize it or something just looked really wrong, again, this is up to the person doing the evaluating to decide, but it should just basically feel right and look right as a 1920s house. Association, if the property is eligible or if it's a contributor because it's associated with some event, like for example, a small dam outside of town that created a small reservoir that supplied the town with irrigation water or drinking water that was treated. That dam should, if it's a historic property, a historic structure, should still convey that association of what it meant to the town or city through all those years. And it's kind of a subjective concept, but you know it when you see it. Any questions? Yes.
Could you tease out the contributor versus non-contributor topic that you're touching on? So are you saying that within a district, they could all be subject to the historic district standards, but there may be a home that we can signify as being a contributor to the, can you just tease out that
Sure. So
idea?
Typically historic districts are composed of contributing properties and non-contributing properties. For a district to be a historic district, it should meet a certain threshold, let's say 75% contributors. Because if we've got 75% non-contributors and 25% contributors, there's not much of a district there. But it's kind of up to the local government decision makers to decide what that threshold is. Contributors must possess adequate integrity. Also, the historic district itself, as a district, is subject to these aspects of integrity as well. So the district needs to sort of feel like a 1880s neighborhood. It needs to, I mean, like, let's say if the neighborhood in the 1980s had a light rail train going through it, and that's just sort of what you see when you walk through it, then that might be an integrity problem for the district. But going back to contributors and non-contributors, yeah, there should be a preponderance of contributors that meet these aspects of integrity relative to the period of significance. So you could make a district, you could say the district is, the period of significance for the district is 1860 to 1980. No one does that, but you could. And then all the houses built in the 1970s could theoretically be contributors. Most districts have a tighter period of significance. It might be something like 1860 to 1920. There's mid-century modern period of significance, mid-century modern historic districts, 1945 to 1975 that exist out there. It just depends on the built environment in your particular town, yeah.
I have adult ADHD, and I want to know, because I think that was a great question. And my personal feeling, people shout me down if I'm wrong. We're challenged with implementing this stuff at a local level, and the background's great, and I read through the thing, and it's fine. But I would really like to get to the end of this so that we can start doing that, because, and you'll help us out with that, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I would like to kind of get there.
Sure thing.
Yeah, not now everyone will blame me for you rushing through. But, because that's a great question. That's a great question.
Right.
There's about 100 other ones just like it. In fact, that question just brought up a whole bunch of questions in my mind. So proceed.
I hope you can write them down and we can get to them. This is basically reiterates what I just said. Historic districts need to meet the aspects of integrity as well in order to be considered a district. The key, I don't know if the laser is working here, but the key component of a district cannot, a component of a district, that is a house in a residential district, cannot contribute to the significance if it has been substantially altered since the period of the district's significance, or it does not share the historic associations of the district. So there is such a thing as non-contributors. I took a look at, and this is, I put this in just to, so for a residential historic district, the 7 aspects, the aspects of integrity that matter the most are design, materials, and workmanship to be a contributor within a residential district. So those are the ones you want to pay attention to. So we'll move quickly. Grass Valley, just a little background on what they've done. 2007, they created a review process, much like Placerville did in 1980, for properties within their 1872 town site, which is 1 square mile. They hired a consultant, Historic Resource Associates out of El Dorado Hills, surveyed the whole square mile, distinguished very significant and significant buildings from those that lacked significance or were modern. They prepared a design review guidelines for the 1872 town site that allows them to step away from the Secretary of Interior standards and go back to their own guidelines when we're making decisions about how to preserve buildings, what to preserve, what permit applications to approve. So these custom design guidelines can be tailored to meet the needs and expectations of local property owners and city leadership. So you all decide what goes into the guidelines. You're not necessarily tied to the national standards, which are the most restrictive and most nuanced and the highest set of standards, because they have to be, because it's a one-size-fit-all. They have to make them the most restrictive because the whole country is, you can't just say that, and these windows, we don't need them. All those windows would disappear throughout America. But you as a local government unit can make those decisions about what you prioritize in design guidelines. So here's their 1 square mile, that green square. The pink and orange properties had significance. The green ones and yellow ones did not. This is the cover of their design guidelines. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I am going to jump to their windows section. So the recommendations rhyme a lot with the Secretary of Interior standards in Grass Valley. Preserve the functional and decorative features of original windows and doors. Windows and doors on the fronts of ancillary buildings should be preserved as well. Avoid creating an additional opening or removing existing ones on facades that are visible from the street. Grass Valley has a pretty restrictive policy on windows. I'm not going to read this 1 through 5 and then 6 through 11. I won't read all of them, but it rhymes a lot with the Secretary of Interior standards. That's the direction they went in. I have included a page from another set of design guidelines for my adopted hometown of Boise, Idaho, and they went in this is the Secretary of Interior standards. You're familiar with this. It looks a lot like Grass Valley's. In Boise, we see that they've made their own decisions about what to prioritize. The design of windows and the manner in which they are arranged can help to manage environmental conditions and are often key factors in sustainable design. Design window configurations to be efficient for passive heating, natural ventilation, or daylighting, and which are similar to those seen historically. So they've made an environmental efficiency and sustainability their priority. And what they have here is in their appropriate and not appropriate list, it's actually acceptable to use fiberglass windows where they appear similar to the original in profile. So a modern design doesn't have to be wood. They've decided that's okay because it increases environmental efficiency. So it's just tailored to their own set of what's important. And then I just wanted to leave you this. We've been seeing this in the consulting world in the last year. A number of cities in California are, instead of bringing on staff that does historic preservation, they're looking for consultants to do on-call historic preservation planning. So like Hercules, this is one I looked at and responded to. It's a small city in the Bay Area. They can't justify having a full-time historic preservation planner, so they have a consultant that they call up on an as-need basis, which isn't very often because there's not too many historic properties in Hercules. But there is an old dynamite factory there. And that was the end. Okay, so one final, so they're looking for historic preservation experts to sort of step in on an as-need basis. And so that's one, I've seen this in some larger cities too, like Anaheim is doing this now as well. We've seen a number of these RFQs go out. So that's one direction that other cities are going in. That's the end of my presentation. I hope that was useful, but I'm thinking the Q&A might be even more useful.
No, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, we weren't sure how long the presentation was, so we wanted to make sure. I know everybody has questions, so we wanted to make sure we kept plenty of time.
Yeah, I might sit down
Yep.
for the Q&A. Thanks.
Just with a single light bulb and yeah.
I'll just go over here.
All right. So I guess the first thing I want to do is open it up, Council and Planning Commission, for any questions or comments at this point.
Mr. Mayor, do you have a preference as to what you want to do, council first, then commission?
Sure, we can do that.
I'll go ahead and start. So I have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with one because it kind of relates to the last part of this. But if we were to develop our own city standards that do not reference the Secretary of Interior standards, there's oftentimes in California state law exemptions for historic districts. Would that jeopardize those exemptions? Because I could see you can't just call something a historic district if the state doesn't feel like what you're doing makes it a historic district. And obviously right now we reference the Secretary of Interior standards, so that's like a clear regulation that, you know, we can defend. But if we were to make our own, would that jeopardize those historic district exemptions?
It's a great question. If Placerville was a CLG, a certified local government, with that relationship with Office of Historic Preservation, I can see that being the case. I don't have an answer for you. If you're not a CLG and you're just a local government with its own ordinance and accepting its own design guidelines, I'm not sure where the state steps in. Are you speaking from experience?
I mean, not specifically, no. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying. What in that instance would you be asking from the state, or the state asking from you with respect to that historic district that would be conforming to Placerville's guidelines?
Well, I'm just thinking, like, I don't know, say we can use modern materials in our historic districts. I'm not saying we should do that by any means. I'm giving a very hypothetical. So like, yes, say we decide we're gonna allow composites and vinyl and plastics to replace deteriorated wood features. And we went that route because it's fire safe or energy efficient. I mean, the example you gave is energy efficiency. So we said, okay, we're okay with that in these circumstances. I don't know, windows comes up a lot here, decking, other things like that. There's a number of state laws, right? Like SB 9, SB 10 that say you have an exemption on some of the things related to lot splitting, offsets, et cetera, if you're a historic district. So I guess my concern is if you were to, I mean, right now, what we have is very defensible, right? We reference the Secretary of Interior standards. I think the state, there wouldn't be any question.
Right.
But if we were to make something more lenient than that, would then those exemptions of those state laws kind of be in jeopardy?
I mean, I don't have an answer for you
Yeah,
right here,
okay.
but it would be absolutely one of those key questions that you would ask going into a process where you're developing your own guidelines. And so it's a great question. I can't answer it.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
And then I think another question I had was, are there circumstances under which historic features and materials that are deteriorated beyond the point of restoration could be replaced with something like a composite under the Secretary of Interior standards, or is that simply not allowed in the language of the SOI? As
Yeah, the Secretary of Interior standards, it's not on the screen anymore, but I'll try and go back to the page. It does have, if I can read it, their language does have, it's qualified with, if possible. I'm paraphrasing, but they do add at the end of their recommended, you know, if let's see if I can find it here. If using the same kind of material is not feasible, then a compatible substitute material may be considered.
Okay. Is there any standard for what's infeasible? Or compatible?
I mean, so in my experience with the city of Boise, they have in their guidelines, they list out what is compatible. So they, like, for example, fiberglass windows as a substitute for wood in some instances. So that might be something for the local government to address.
All right, I'll let other people.
Yeah, Chair, if I could just help a little bit with that question that the council member raised. I know from the experience that we've had with projects coming before us, and especially through the Planning Commission, it's that the Planning Commission is required to make certain findings under the Secretary of Interior standards. If, say, for example, we have a deteriorated wood-framed window or siding, and they want to use a different kind of material, typically the findings are financial infeasibility. It's too expensive to replace it and have like wood planed to match the shiplap on the siding, or it's technically infeasible. And is there some aspects of the window that it's just a window that just can't be refabricated, and then technically then the homeowner would be able to use a different kind of a window. And I'm not sure how that would apply to the materials, but I think that's something maybe I think that would be helpful, especially for the commission. We've been grappling with that quite a bit.
Question that was asked by Councilmember Gottberg. You've given us an answer about the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, but if you had that same problem with the Grass Valley guidelines, what would be the answer? And the outline only referred to the Grass Valley material, but it's about 154 pages. Could you just tell us how that would apply if we get the situation where we need to consider replacing something like windows? What does it say can be done?
Grass Valley, or
Yeah, the
Secretary of
Grass
Interior?
Valley guidelines. We're currently using the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, but if we were to use something like the Grass Valley guidelines, what would its answer be?
Well, you can tailor the guidelines to your own city. So Grass Valley, I'll have to look at the slide, but if I can read it, it's a bit small. But I guess my larger point that I'm trying to drive home is that cities like Placerville are free to develop their own guidelines. They should basically rhyme with the Secretary of Interior standards, but there's nuances that you can add into your own guidelines that may address a particular problem that you encounter in your city that maybe another city rarely deals with. So if you find hardy board siding acceptable as a substitute for wood, and Planning Commission, Council, Mayor, the leadership all agrees, then that can be written into your guidelines for your city. And as far as issues about a permit applicant does not agree with the Planning Commission's interpretation of the Secretary of Interior standards, I assume they could appeal up to the council, and then ultimately it's the council's decision to decide whether or not the permit is approved. Fair to say?
Yes, I know. To Kirk's question, I did read quite a bit actually yesterday and today of Grass Valley's standards, and like everything, they have an off ramp. So basically, it's this, and this. So it kind of follows the interior standards, which are identify, retain, preserve. If you can't do that, protect and maintain. If you can't, repair it if you can. And then lastly, it's replace. And then there's sort of an off ramp within their standards to be able to do that. What I didn't have time to do is go and look like for a specific YouTube video of a hearing, like on a window or something where it came up. But they have an off ramp where if you can't actually fix something, there is latitude for the planning commission and or city council, or in this case, it's historic advisory commission, that does the initial intake for the city of Grass Valley. So I think like all of these, as Nathan mentioned, there's always but, which gives us, the ability to make findings to do something potentially different. And I think, John and I were just saying here, sidebar was, the bigger question of what do we want the residents of Placerville to do? I mean, as a body that, as two of us that are going to be seeing this the most, I mean, do we want a very prescriptive way of doing this? I think all of us probably, we all want to maintain our and preserve our buildings and do those things. The question is in what format and how do we want to do that? And how much of the interior standards do we want to adhere to in a way that makes it difficult for people to do anything but try to do a like-for-like replacement? And is it feasible? I mean, I think that's the other question. So, things that I wouldn't mind hearing from people just on that more 30,000-foot level as opposed to just into the weeds of individual examples.
Well, I'll add that I started with that context about what is preservation to remind us that preservation is about making sure Placerville remains Placerville and doesn't become any other abstract city. So you want to protect what makes Placerville Placerville. If swapping out wood siding for hardy board, in your judgment, erodes that which is Placerville, maybe that wood siding was lumbered locally and it was just is real special, and that's fine. But the cities do have a certain amount of latitude to develop their own guidelines. They should rhyme with the Secretary of Interior standards to some extent. Certainly, if you want to be a certified local government, that's the case. But you do have the freedom to tailor the guidelines. What you think is appropriate.
One quick question on the certified local government. I hadn't heard that before, but can you give us an example of a city that is a certified local government?
Sacramento, Davis, Elk Grove is a new certified local government. Any local government, be it county or city, can become a certified local government historic preservation program, and that means that you have certain aspects of your program established, an advisory, historic preservation advisory commission, a local register with some zoning teeth, and an ordinance. and those are the big parts of it. And then you are, so what do you get out of it? You get access to state grants that can help you meet preservation objectives, like a new survey and inventory, or developing a new set of guidelines for a district or for a city. So it opens up doors to grant money from the Office of Historic Preservation.
All right, I'm gonna jump in here for a couple things. Got a couple of different questions. And I think a lot of this material stuff is coming up from a lot of different reasons. But my question for you is in your recent experience, one of the things that we're dealing with a lot up here in Northern California is the high fire danger, the high fire insurance, the restrictions, that kind of stuff. So in the historical districts, obviously, if we're sticking to the interior standards, we're trying to meet the materials and the housing, but what we're running into, especially with our citizens, is the fact that by doing that, their insurances are also now higher. I mean, we're not talking just a few $100, we're talking thousands of dollars. So I think some of the things that we're trying to look for here is how can we help our citizens still keep our historical look and our, historical neighborhoods as they are, but at the same time try and help them reduce these thousands of dollars that they're paying in insurance because, hey, guess what? You're all wood-sided house. It's really old this, you get, so that's some of the issues that, California's running into, at least in our area.
Yeah. So the SOI standards are the same in Placerville as they are in Louisiana. And so that a great thing is that they're available, and it's not they're available for cities to use. The downside is they're not customized to the particular circumstances of each and every city and town out there. So if there's a high fire danger here, that's something that a local guidelines could be more sensitive to and perhaps tailor the preservation program to.
And then my second question was with our historical districts. If a historical district has had enough, it was designated as a historical district, but over the years has had a bunch of change to it because of changing in materials and such. So we don't, what is our threshold of contributors that keeps it historical before all of a sudden we're past that point and we're going, oh, wait a minute here, this really isn't a historical district anymore. How do we fix this?
It's subjective to each local government. I've heard of a 3 strikes and you're out rule down in Arizona. I worked with the city of Tempe, so other cities could have a higher threshold or a lower threshold, but you would need a new survey to determine those contributors from non-contributors, those which have integrity and those which don't, because a lot has happened probably since 1980 out there, it might require a resurvey, but you begin that resurvey with your own local understanding of what a contributor is versus what is a non-contributor.
Yeah. Well, what I want to understand is we have our buildings of national historic significance. Now, if we started applying standards that said, you can use vinyl as long as it still looks historic, are we risking those national historic buildings still being on the register? What point are we risking that status?
So it's up for each and every property owner of a property that's on the National Register of Historic Places to prove periodically to the National Park Service that the property still retains integrity. It's a big issue in states where there's property tax reclassification associated with historic properties that are on the National Register. You'll find that in Mills Act counties in California. I'm not sure if El Dorado County is a Mills Act county.
No, we're not.
Which,
that actually leads to a question I've had, but please continue your thought, and I'd like to ask you another question.
So the greatest penalty for losing integrity for a property on the National Register of Historic Places is that you get delisted from the National Register of Historic Places. And you may not enjoy the benefits of having your property listed on the National Register. So it's up to each and every property owner to decide how important that is. With a local property register, then you go and you apply for a building permit, and it's the local government that can say, this is not conform to our standards for properties that are individually eligible or contributors within a district. And then it's the local government that decides whether or not to issue the building permit. But the National Register is, doesn't protect properties. Hope that answers your question.
You don't know. I mean, essentially, you know, you're not saying if you change these, you're going to jeopardize the National Historic Register. I mean, I'm not hearing a real answer
Potentially.
there.
I mean, well, every property is different, so I can't.
Well, I thought we were supposed
Yeah.
to ask questions. I'm asking questions.
No, it's a great question, but it's a case-by-case basis.
I guess the question would be, how would somebody know if you change the gargoyle on the front of your building? How does the national, it's kind of like it's like any zoning or code violation. Someone would have to complain.
Well, the Park Service has a National Register nomination on file that they then
Right.
compare.
But how would the National Park Service, this is really rabbit hole-y stuff, but just for my own edification, how would they know that a building in some town in the middle of the country used a composite wood product rather than?
Well, I've only heard of property owners having to prove integrity in states where there's property tax reclassification at stake. So if there's not that at stake, I can't really imagine a scenario where there's people going out to searching Google Street View to see if a house still has integrity or not.
One of the challenge, I'm all for historic preservation. Don't get me wrong. One of the challenges that I've ever had with this subject is I think in these districts we cast a broad net, and the question that came up about contributing and non-contributing, because on any given street, you can go up Cedar Ravine. There's some very classic examples of things, and you'd look at those and go, yeah, and it's kind of like whatever, But then there's just a whole bunch of houses. There's just a bunch of houses. They've been stuccoed, they've been changed, all sorts of things have happened. And do you really want to? I want to use real inflammatory words. Do you want to force people to do things in those homes just because they geographically fall into a certain spot of town, or not? And that's a question for us in the community. And I will tell you the story of my house. I love talking about myself. My wife and I, first house we ever bought in town back in the mid '80s is over by the high school on Myrtle Avenue. It's cute as a bug's ear. We wanted another house that was actually newer, but it was more expensive. And the house we could afford was the cute little house on Myrtle Avenue. We didn't buy it because we wanted a reconstruction project. We bought it because it's what we could afford. And a little of this, a little of it is elitist. We think everybody that buys an old house in town here wants to take on Pella and Anderson windows and real wood doors and wood siding that's milled by some, I don't know, Amish person out somewhere, because that's the only place you can get this stuff. And it's, for a lot of people, that's not the case. They buy the house they can, especially in California and especially in Placerville. If you walked by our house, and the main part of our house was built sometime around the turn of the last century, by pieces of wood I think the guy found on the street somewhere. And then it was added on to in the 30s, and then we added an addition, totally permitted, by the way, in the late 90s. If you look at the front of our house, because we broke the rule, we wanted to make the new part look like the old part. If you walk by our house, you go, wow, that's a real cute house. We've replaced every window in the house with vinyl. You'd go, wow, because we got the windows with the things inside, so they would look like individual pane windows, but they're not. You can't do that in Grass Valley. They'd shoot you or something. You walk by our house, it's got shiplap siding. It looks beautiful. 2/3 of the house is encased in aluminum because the shiplap is aluminum siding. The other side is Hardybacker because that was more robust than any wood product we could find. But if you walk by our house, you'd say, God, look at that cute little house. It's got the cute windows and it's got the porch and all that. And I think we hamstring people. We assume one thing, they got more money than they really do and they bought this house to do all this stuff. And then we assume old is historic. And I think we need to reevaluate that, not to take everybody off the hook, because some people do want to be cheap. And they live in a really old historic place in town, and that should be protected. But I think we really need to evaluate this. That's my 2 cents worth, because I think some of the challenges, we apply this brush to everybody. And I think from a policy standpoint, I would like to get it more focused. and a little bit more reasonable, not give away the farm. Because who knows, maybe 150 years ago, they would have used a composite wood product as opposed to whatever they could find around here. Because they were smart people, and they said, well, this is going to last forever. Anyway, sorry, that was
Well,
my rant.
a historic district requires buy-in from the property owners within the district. So my follow-up question, I don't think you can answer it right now, but you would want to know how much buy-in you have in these historic districts from 1980.
It begs the question, should you come back periodically and ask people that very same question? I mean, to me, because if this stuff was done in 81, that was the year I moved here.
Before I was born.
Well, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, Nicole.
Mr. Mayor, so I appreciate John's comments, but I'd like to defer to Commissioner Keeney for she's had her light on, and then maybe I'd like to come back if I
I'd like
could.
to revisit the statement and the question about the Mills Act and the property valuation. And what I'm hearing here, I think we all realize that Placerville needs, we're on the cusp of considering revamping and maybe, reworking somehow. But in your experience, are most of the communities that have the historic districts and have maybe their own guidelines or the SOIS that they rely on, do they offer an economic incentive or a Mills Act enrollment? The city of Placerville does not. And so what I struggle with is that the city has these very restrictive standards that were developed for federal projects where there was a lot of grant money. And the examples that you'll see, are big projects, multi-story, and lots of money to rehab them. In Placerville, we have, kind of a mixture, mostly residential. And so what I struggle with is the strict application of these standards to housing stock that we really need to focus on preserving. So I just want to know, in your experience, are most of these communities, are they under the Mills Act, or do they find another way to underwrite or promote the rehabilitation, the preservation of these houses? And that's primarily what the Planning Commission is faced with.
Well, the Mills Act is a county decision to whether to participate in the Mills Act. And I believe that the Mills Act provides financial incentives for properties that are individually eligible, not necessarily a contributor to a district. But I would have to look into that. Okay. But I believe the Mills Act, for those counties that participate, it's a property tax incentive for individually eligible.
Right, so the city would then need to negotiate with the County of El Dorado to consider this, and I'm not sure.
But I'm not sure it would incentivize contributors within a residential historic district. They would have to be individually eligible just by themselves, as a wonderful Queen Anne house from 1880, individually eligible for the National Register.
Eligible for the National Historic Register, as
Yes.
opposed to something that's in one of our historic districts.
I believe so, but we'll have to look at the Mills.
So as far as you know, there's not
Yeah.
a way to help underwrite the costs.
But your other question about, well, what incentivizes these residential historic districts, if not, property tax reclassification or Mills Act participation? In my experience, what I've seen is that because it was in the early 1980s when, not just in California, but almost all states, where we started to see historic preservation activity and the creation of historic districts and the survey and inventory work being done by local governments to see what's out there. And the residential historic districts started with a groundswell of participation from property owners in historic neighborhoods. And there was a lot of community buy-in, property owners working with city staff and leadership to create the district. And this would have been in 1980, maybe the early 1990s. And those same property owners have, up until very recently, been there ever since. Like you've been in your house since 1980. A lot of the historic districts, especially in Sacramento and Midtown, a lot of those historic districts are owned by the houses within the district are owned by the folks that were involved in creating the district in the early 1980s. And so it's a little bit of a question where we go from here as those properties are acquired by new homeowners. So the second generation of owners comes along. Are they still buying into the residential historic district concept? Is it frustrating for them? Did they buy that house because it's in a historic district and that's what they were looking for? So in some ways it remains to be seen. It's kind of unfolding before our eyes as people are moving around more after 2020, probably more than they ever have been.
I'd like to say, I think this is a very, very important point. And I don't know what drove the city to create the historic districts back when it did. I think what's true is everyone, commission, council, the city, we value the historic district. We value the preservation. We think that's really important to us, okay? And we want to be objective in our decision-making. And we've adopted the standards as a means by which we achieve that objectivity. But within the utilization of the standards, there are challenges, there are questions I think we need to answer. And at the end of the day, this becomes an issue of managing expectations. Because we actually, the city, we have expectations of people who find themselves in these historic districts about how we control and expect them to manage their property, right? And one of the things I don't think we do a very good job of, I was on the city website today. I said, I'm going to find all the requirements for the historic districts. You know what? If it is so important to us, it should be right on our splash page. Requirements for historic districts. And there should be resources, there should be an application checklist, there should be definitions, there should be here's what you can do, here's what you can't, et cetera, 1, 2, 3, 4. I do not know what the residents of the historic districts, how they feel about it now. I can tell you one thing, in all the years I've been on commission, and it's many, I have not had my door beat down by people in the historic district saying, I really support the historic district because I believe it's bringing value to my properties. We sit here at the city, we sit up there and we say, it's bringing value to your properties, blah, blah, and that it's probably true. But we need to be serving, this is my opinion here, we need to be serving people. If this is something that's important to us, how can we facilitate it happening and let people know? Right now we say, well, the real estate agent should be telling people. I think that's a fail. I think the city, it needs to be just obvious from the city. You're in a historic district. Okay, here's all the stuff. And how can we do a better job with that? The other thing I've heard is that there's a lot of flexibility in the adaptation of the SOI for our community. So I think we need to have more work done on that so we know. And then we as commissioners, I'll speak for myself, man, I need a lot more training on SOI because I want to do it right, but it's like you said, there's a lot of nuance. It's dense, and there's a lot of stuff. And I always fall back to, well, is it economically feasible? Well, what does that mean? In fact, even in here, in our Title 10, Chapter 4, it says, I'm quoting, which have special historical and aesthetic interest and value. And how is that defined? I don't know. Anyway, so thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you have a historic preservation program with a local historic district, I would encourage any city to have bells and whistles go off when a demolition permit is pulled for a property in the historic district. But the very minute questions about windows and siding, there is flexibility if you want to step away from the SOI standards and develop your own standards.
May I?
Another follow-up question back to the SOI standards, which is, where we stand now. I don't know what we're going to do in 6 months or a year, but right now we're working with those. And what comes before Planning Commission routinely are windows. And when I read the standards, they talk about design, color, texture, and other visual properties. But those aren't things that we really consider when what comes to us are windows. And what are those windows made out of? In your experience with those standards or with other small communities, is Placerville kind of missing the mark by focusing on windows. To me, it feels like we put way too much emphasis on that, where if a visual property is maintained, the actual material of that window, to me, is less important. And I want to look at the overall look of the house as it stands now. So just give us your professional experience in other communities. Should we give that, those other elements, design, color, and texture, also give those emphasis when a project proponent comes to the city and they, not only do they want to change the windows, but they want to go from stucco to, you know, hardy board or something like that. So what's your experience, and should we is that our prerogative? Can we establish a hierarchy?
It is your prerogative. Windows and siding are the two real sensitive parts of a residential exterior that preservationists will fight over, particularly windows. But yes, it is your prerogative. You're using the SOI standards because they're there, and it's great that they're there, but they're the most restrictive. That's the highest level of standard, as it should be, because it's one-size-fit-all document. But it is your prerogative to...
It's something that the city should define.
Yes.
That we don't care so much about color or texture or design. You know, we should specify that in our guidelines.
As a planning commission and then as a council, what are your priorities in terms of these smaller preservation questions? Yes.
May I? Hi. So one, I also went on the website approaching it as a homeowner, and I actually took all of the text and fleshed it out and rewrote both of the web pages that we have. And I also found a letter. I love wordsmithing, so it's just nerd out on it. So I did flesh that out, and I think that with just a little bit of changes can really be enhanced to have people that land there understand. I also found a letter template online from like 1991 from I don't know where that notified people that they lived in a historic district, and I thought it was really well written. I meant to send it to staff, but for some reason my internet wasn't working right before I came, and so I just finished it. And so I did find this letter that I think would be really good for us to consider sending out annually as either a notification or a reminder that people are in the historic district, that they should reference our materials that we have then flushed out online for them to be able to understand. So I think that is a big component, just knowledge. My second question has more to do with actually the district itself. So would a potential next step be for us to sort of take a snapshot where we are today? Things have happened between 1981 and now in the historic districts. Would it behoove us to say, okay, we're going to take a snapshot in 2023, and this is what we consider to be the district as it currently lives. This is what we want it to stay as, things like that. Then identify our period of interest, because that was interesting to me. We're now almost 75 years out of 1950. And so is that historic? Is that considered historically significant that it's post-World War II building? Do we want those kinds of homes to be maintained and preserved as they are? Is that something, I guess I'm kind of asking two questions here, but let me go back to what I said and then I'll ask that question. So we could identify our period of interest and then identify contributors versus non-contributors within the district. And then when they come to us, if they're a contributor house, we could hold them to a little bit higher standard, but then the non-contributors could still come before us so that we're maintaining the district, but we allow, say, vinyl windows in those ones. Would that be a course of action that would be acceptable?
Yes, I've seen that. Exactly what you say there. So the contributors are held to a higher standard.
Okay.
And the non-contributors, we're not going to allow a demolition permit and then a construction of a McMansion. It's totally out of scale with the historic district, but we will allow for a non-contributor certain changes that we may not allow for a contributor.
That's really great, because I think, could we have like a menu of, if you're a contributor, here you have to have wood windows, for example.
I think that would be great.
And then a menu for non-contributing houses within a historic district, so you still have to come before Planning Commission so that we do maintain the integrity of the district, but we have a little bit more leeway on, say, a 1950s home that wants to put in.
Yes, I've seen that done.
Okay.
That's
And
how
you
it's,
think that
yeah.
is valuable for the district?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
To go back to your first point about notifying property owners that are in the district that may have contributors or may be non-contributors. When I was in Arizona in 2012, a Senate bill was passed, and for each and every contributing property in every historic district in all of Arizona and all the local governments, the preservation planners had to go and get a signature from the property owner of because historic preservation and going before a historic preservation commission and then a planning commission and up to a city council was interpreted as a taking. And so there was a great reset in 2012 whereby every property owner of a contributing property in a historic district had to sign a piece of paper confirming that they are still a contributor. And if they did not want to be a contributor at that moment in time, they could opt out. That was Arizona, but just as a in terms of telling a little story. So I think that transparency is positive, and
I would imagine that led to quite the decrease just on.
Well, they have a property tax reclassification, 50% property tax reclassification for contributors in districts. So if you wanted to forfeit your property tax incentive, then sure.
That would be the okay.
Yeah,
we don't have that here, so it's a different animal from that perspective. Kirk, did you have anything else? Because if not, I was going to open it up for public comments.
Just a couple things.
Yep.
Several of you talked about the inconsistencies you find in the Interior Secretary's guidelines, but I'd ask you to take a look at the Grass Valley guidelines because it's much more flexible, and nobody can dispute that Grass Valley does not have a great interest in preserving their historic area. It's a beautiful community. So the Grass Valley standards do show you there's ways to address these various issues you've talked about. I guess what I wanted to suggest is you talked earlier offhandedly about consistently inconsistent, but you, the City Council, in 2011 gave a mandate for what the Historic Advisory Committee was to do. Those duties were then transferred to this group 5 years ago, or 8 years ago. And it is to, among other things, provide advice about the guidelines to do exactly what you're doing now. And some effort has been done towards proposing doing that months ago, and we were told, well, wait, we're going to have a conference, a joint conference. And one of the mandates was updating the standards of inventory that we have in the area. And no, wait until we have this meeting. You need to consider that these guidelines do have to be modified. They're long overdue for all the reasons you described earlier. Safety standards, fire prevention, et cetera. But Grass Valley does have a much more flexible standard that's in some ways more complex that addresses those various kinds of situations where you have a house in the 1950s and one in the 1850s on the same block. So I think that's one of the things you might want to do is go back to that resolution 7980 where you said that it was the Planning Commission. Maybe we don't want to do it, but give us a chance to do what we've been talking about for a number of months. And believe me, the commissioner on my right can really prove everything. I mean, and that's one of the things that needs to be done. You look at that, it's not user-friendly, the website, and it needs to be, and people need to be told about it. Pardon?
I said I'm fixing it.
Oh, yeah.
Just kidding.
It needs to be done. We have an issue that we have expertise about is over and over people come in and say, I didn't know we were in a historic district. I didn't know that I had to get a building permit when I put in a water heater. And, somebody ought to start jerking licenses of those who are contractors who go ahead and do it when they know better. So there's some enforcement needs to be done. Thank you.
The thing about not knowing, I agree, we should send a letter to them once a year, that's fine. They won't read it, but that's great. At least we'll have done our due diligence to say, hey, we sent you a letter once a year. It always bothers me when these people, and I watched a number of your meetings now when they had to do with windows, doors, siding, that sort of stuff, so I could kind of get a flavor for the topic. I love it when people can manage to figure out a way to spend like $800,000 or $900,000 on a house. Will know all about that and can navigate and obviously have jobs and money and some wherewithal. But then when it comes to, should I get a permit to do this? Oh, I don't know. Then they become totally like, I understand. There might be some little things like the water heater thing. Okay, permit, no permit. I get it. Replacing windows, replacing your siding, replacing decks, replacing all sorts of things. Yeah, thank you. Anyway, sorry.
The giggle test is, yeah.
It's hard to take.
No, and the district, I love the district conversation because, like, for instance, my house, I'm in a historic district, and my house is on the inventory, the city of Placerville's historic inventory. But my next door neighbor is a manufactured house, so it's, go figure, right? I mean, and then the other houses are all a little bit different. So it's, I mean, no, not at all. So it's a very diverse neighborhood. I will say that. All right. So with that, thank you everybody for the comments.
Mayor
We'll have,
Sirico,
yes.
I just wanted to ask our expert.
Yes, go ahead.
If
Go
you
for it.
just
Absolutely.
give me a couple more minutes of his time. Obviously, we're moving in a certain direction of modifying our current ordinance, but for right now, we are still bound by the Secretary of Interior standards. Can you enlighten us on what the current application is? You didn't really get to that in part of your presentation. I saw that you were going to talk about workmanship, and we've kind of alluded to the exceptions for, we talked about economic, but what is the current state of applying these standards? What kind of materials are routinely allowed that are still meet the approval, the SOI standards? Are you seeing any trends? Like we are all about windows, so routinely our vinyl windows on something that's on the historic register? Is that ever allowed? What other kinds of new materials are you seeing in the industry being accepted and so that a structure doesn't lose its registration?
Well, the two that come to mind is hardy siding and fiberglass windows.
Fiberglass.
But you use some words, I don't want to pick on you, but you're not bound to the SOI standards. They're guidelines. You as a planning...
As long as we make the findings.
I'm sorry?
For the standards. Is that what you're saying? We're not bound?
You're not bound to them. You use them as a basic set of principles, but it's not code. So you need to, I recommend you consider that distinction between code and guidelines. Mm-hmm. And it'd be the same if you publish your own set of guidelines if you go that route. But you are the ultimate decision-making authority. Council is the ultimate decision-making authority, but there's two levels of decision-making. So your job is to consider the application and also consider the guidelines, the SOI standards, and find a decision that accommodates both in the best way possible. And that's what when you read the preamble to the Secretary of Interior standards, they note that it's not law. It's just a set of guidelines and general principles, and some very specific principles as you get into the weeds with it. But ultimately, your responsibility is to make the decision that is best for your community, not what's best for what's absolutely written in the SOI standards. That's why they have those little qualifiers at the end. They say, but if you can't, if there's no other possible alternative, then do what you will. You find that. So I would just encourage you to balance the needs of the community with the SOIs. Maybe not put the SOI standards above your own sense of what's appropriate. In
the case of a house or structure that is on the National Historic Register, is it the local jurisdiction's authority to be like the first line of imposing the SOI standards if it's an actually listed property, not in our maybe within our historic district, but a special property that has that designation, and they want to they want to change something possibly significantly. Is the local jurisdiction the first line of
Well, it's the first line and last line. It's the first line and last line. The National Register of Historic Places is administered by the National Park Service, and the National Park Service doesn't issue building permits or demolition permits. So the city government or the planning commission at the county level. City and county is the only line of defense for protecting properties. When you change a property listed on the National Register, the only penalty, if you will, is you could be delisted.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up for public comment. I know we're getting closer to our time that we were supposed to, and we can certainly go longer, but I also want to be sensitive to everybody's time. The one thing I will ask for, because originally I was going to say, all right, we'll give people a lot more time to speak on this, but we kind of went through a lot of discussion. So if you can be as concise as possible, I would really appreciate it. And if it's just a question, just ask the question, and then we will, whether we get it into tonight or whether we get back with more information or with an answer later, we will do that. But I do want to get in as many questions as possible. So, and if it's just a comment, then certainly that as well. So with that, we'll go. Yeah, let's go back to 3. Back to 3 minutes. I want to be able to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak. And we'll see where we get to through the end of public comments. If there are any cards, please bring those forward, and we'll enter those into the record as well, if anyone filled out a card. But go ahead, Michael.
Is this being recorded, or, because I'm going to speak real fast, I have a lot of points I would like to see make Placerville better. Number one, we absolutely have to adopt our own set of standards. We have some great ideas out of Grass Valley and the SOI. So these are things I would like to see. I would like to see us adopt, say, a historical restoration permit, a special permit that's good for maybe even 5 years. One set low fee that's going to encourage people to do the right thing, and it will take away the excuse, it's going to cost me so much more to replace all my windows. Well, just do one wall every year or two. That removes that. If you give them one set fee, they come in all the things they want to do on their place. They got one fee and it's good for 5 or 10 years. I don't care, but that would help. I would like to see the city give it a year, 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, whatever is the standard for the application of a special review and or demolitions. And please, at the end of adopting special review, are they guidelines? What's a guideline and what's the law? Be very specific about that. I like Grass Valley's, they have a list of historical context, documents that contain events and persons. I don't believe we have that. I do support the in-kind materials, identical composition, shape, form, design, but we are seeing modern materials, composites, that if, say, you come up with a standard 80%, 90% mimics what's there, it has wood grain, it has the skinny mullions, all those things. I would think that you could add something to demand maintenance. So deterioration can be called on the place. Same for neglect. Yes to asking the county to join the Mills Act. Choose what year is. I really want demos. We have historic buildings outside of the historic district and they're being demoed, $100 over the counter, knock it down. I think anything on the historic resource list, regardless if it's in a district or not, should have protection and planning commission review before demo. I like the Grass Valley code. There's a list of 10 points of criteria in determining levels of significance. I think we could have 2 or 3 different levels. The visible from a public street, I think causes a problem. You get a mishmash of windows. Everything visible from the street has to be one thing, and on the back they can do whatever they want. We have to change that. We have to avoid the mismatch. The entire structure, exterior, needs to be the same. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you for the presentation, much appreciated. The reason I'm here, the reason I care, is because I own an 1856 building downtown, and I care about historic districts. I care about the history of the downtown buildings, and I'm hoping that someday we have a historic district for those buildings downtown, as well as the 4 residential districts. I'll try to be quick. I have a lot of comments. First of all, could you tell me the spelling of your last name?
Hallam, Hallam.
Hallam. Great, thank you. I'm sure that'll be important for history when we look back on this presentation. The benefits of being on the registration, I think sometime that should be discussed other than tax benefits. And I know there are some buildings downtown that are receiving some great tax benefits. And that needs to be disclosed, I think, and discussed. You all discussed the technical difficulties sometimes of creating and replacing some piece on a historic house, you know, the siding, whatever, having it milled and that kind of thing. But in actuality, yes, it's an issue. I've sat in on many planning commission meetings when it comes to these historic districts. And really, the reality of what I hear is either I didn't know, it's unfair, my neighbors haven't done this, then people are busted for not even having a permit like was discussed, and they're brought into planning commission in these historic districts for not having pulled a permit, especially if it's a contractor who should know better. So I think it's really what is the will of the planning commission, because I've seen some pretty soft reaction to a lot of this. Not recently, not since the latest 2 have been on the planning commission, and then certainly when Nicole Gottberg was a planning commissioner, she was really stuck to the ordinances. And so I think it's really, this body needs to really have a vision for what they want, if they're serious about it. Because if everyone gets off the hook when they come and complain that they don't have the money, well, then what's the point? It's really a futile exercise. And I really believe in buyer beware. Look, all of us who own homes, I did my research. Am I in a flood zone? What's my fire hazard? I had to buy my mineral rights. The bank made me buy my mineral rights. I mean, there's all kinds of research. So yeah, you guys can send letters, great. You can improve your website, that's great too. But people who make the biggest investment of their lives need to do a little research. And I just have kind of this much sympathy for people who show up and say, I didn't know. Really? You spent all this money and you didn't do research? Let's see, quickly, Historic Advisory Committee. I really hope you bring that back. If you want to become a certified city, this is a very complex issue. I know it was last we had it was 2015. Let me just, can I quickly finish? Turns out I've said a lot of this. Let's see, website, buyer beware. Yeah, I guess I've somehow managed to say my 10 items. Thank you.
Ruth.
The other Ruth of Placerville, Ruth Carter. So I just want to say that I think this is great that everybody's getting together to really address the elephant in the room, and that's the fact that the city of Placerville has kind of ignored this for a long time and been remiss in keeping up the inventory records. I think that a positive direction forward is going to be City Council and Planning Commission getting together and saying, we need our survey to get our updated inventory. We don't know the condition of neighborhoods by and large in terms of, making the qualification. Has there been too much remodeling done to one home or another? So I think having an updated inventory would be pivotally important to being able to adopt our city's own policy if we're going to go that direction. So I just want to say that I hope that we all agree that we need an updated inventory, and that will help us to move forward.
Thank you, Ruth.
Hi. I do have a house in the historic district. And I know when I said at the meeting of the Planning Commission that it's very difficult as a homeowner to find out answers to your questions, and I was told, no, it's not. Yes, it is. And I talked to 4 contractors so far, since I've been here the last 6 years. Each of them has said the same thing. Don't get a building permit. No matter what you do, don't get a building permit. build to code, and if they come and catch you, then deal with it. Now, that doesn't seem to me like the way to go, but when we bought the house, it had all the building permits. Turns out our building permits turned up in someone else's house as well, across the street from us. And that particular house has done a whole bunch of renovation, put in a multi-unit apartment building in the house, and it was never permitted. I've been told that that would be taken care of, hasn't been taken care of. And there's many, many, many people living in this house, different people at different times. I see them go in the morning. They're all construction workers, not sure what the deal is. But again, it's the historic district. Across the road from me, that owner isn't going to do anything with the house. He's just going to hold on to it. And he's rented out previously to very notorious drug dealers. And so that brought that into the neighborhood. These are real issues. Some of us, we bought in the historic district because we love being in the historic district. Shocked to find out that downtown wasn't part of the historic district, but it isn't. And so we bought 5 acres out by Coloma because I'm not going to just walk on eggshells where I live. So we do what we do in Coloma, and we haven't done anything to this house other than live there. And we love it. It's got a lot of potential. And it has a 2-story stone staircase. Well, I think that's pretty novel. I don't think you want to get rid of that. But what do you do with this sort of stuff? I mean, how do you maintain that that's going to be maintained by the homeowners? And money is a big issue. I mean, we're fortunate we're not exactly without finances, but I mean, we're not going to be spending huge amounts to do ridiculous things that nobody else is going to be doing. And, you know, I went across the road on Bedford and watched what has gone in on the Kennedy House and all that stuff. Now I'm starting to, okay, these are all cheap rentals. No wonder they aren't maintained. Where's the money coming from to pay for any sort of renovation? Anyway, that's what I have to say. It would be fun to find out how to get information, and I'd love to be in a workshop that discusses that.
Thank you for your comments.
Hi, Paul Kojala. I do have a little home in the historic district as well, and like you, want to do some things to it, and I do appreciate everything the city council, the commission, and the staff's working for it. Thank you for being here and pointing out some truths that were very important. A couple things though, a time frame of reworking this would help all of us that are renovating homes. I know you're not going to have that tonight, but that is an important thing to come up with. And I just want to encourage you to include some of us homeowners in the planning of this, because I think we have a good say of what we want and what we don't want in the historic district, and contributors and non-contributors and these kind of things. So 2 things, time frame, and include some of us if possible when we go through the works of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of great information. So I just wanted to say that I would love to see the Historical Advisory Committee reformed. To consider that, I think it would be a great help to staff and give property owners a chance to weigh in on their experiences. I also want to concur that a comprehensive inventory would be most helpful in considering the historical districts and properties. And I also do agree that the homes that are considered in a historical neighborhood and don't meet that criteria absolutely need different standards to replace windows and other aspects to restore their properties. So thank you again, and I look forward to hearing what comes next.
Thank you for your comments.
My name is Jacob Rigoli. I own an older property in one of the historical districts and consider myself a preservationist. This matters quite a lot to my husband and me in our planning together in helps of restoring the property. I'm also a part of the Historical Society. I actually want to ask if it's a question, if it's possible, Professor Hallam, your presentation, is it possible to pull it up again to look at one of the pictures that you showed? And I think it's relevant because we could, if that's a possibility, it's the picture that shows, maybe two pictures, one that shows the freeway going through town, and then the other picture that shows the corner of Cedar Ravine and Pacific Street. And if it's not possible, it's not possible. That's quite okay. But I think it will help orient us about around one additional perspective here that I don't want to lose track of. Exactly. So there's the freeway. And this perspective that I'm going to offer is one that really zooms out to a 10,000-foot level or even higher. And that is a memory of what we were also as a city many years ago that frankly none of us were here for. That street, the Highway 50 now, actually bisecting Placerville, actually contributed to the loss of many properties that I think we all here regret that we've lost, and also the continuity of the city. I say that because it's not just a question of the individual properties, and sometimes we really get, sort of caught up in the weeds of the individual properties, and that's very important. I love the reference to the Grass Valley standards. Maybe that's a guide for us to aspire to. But I also want to suggest that we should stay at a high level also and remember that there will be events that come before us as a city where we may be contemplating moving monuments, creating new, streets through downtown, expanding areas, and we may cause something like this to happen. Maybe not at that scale, but potentially at a scale that, frankly, future individuals decades from now who don't know us, we're long gone, may regret that we made those decisions. One more picture, the one that shows the corner of Cedar Ravine and Pacific Streets. I think it's the next one in the list. There we go. And right on the right-hand side there, that's the former, former intercounty title building, now being converted into a dentist office there. That was actually the site of J&J Blair Lumber Company. And that was the Blair family who migrated here in the 1850s. They owned Sportsman's Hall. They created that, and then they later transferred down into Placerville to open up a lumber mill right on that corner. So again, things we've forgotten. We replaced it with a building that's about to be historic now itself in its age. Very curious, but I think if we can preserve those buildings and remember that perspective, we'll do a great service to the present Placerville community and its future community as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Sue Rodman, City of Placerville. I don't see how you can do anything about historic districts until you have an inventory of what you have that is historic or is not historic. So until you have an updated inventory, how would you even go about this? I think there are some things that you need to look at in terms of the ordinances and how to implement those, and looking at what people can and cannot do, and what they can afford and what they cannot afford. And I watched this old house, and they do quite a bit of historic renovations, and they do not always use historic materials, but they use materials that look the same, that have been milled or manufactured to be the same. So if you've got double hung windows, they have double hung windows. They may be fiberglass double hung windows, but they are double hung windows. And they are double pane windows, so that you've got the energy efficiency that allows you to be able to afford the heat and cool this home. And I know my experience, I bought a home in Placerville, and it had aluminum sliding windows. Well, the heating bill for that winter was horrendous. So the next year, I said, okay, when you buy any place, you make a list of the things you need to do. And replacing those windows was about number 7 on my list. After that winter, it went to number 1. We replaced them that summer with good wood Anderson double pane windows, casement windows. They actually look a lot better on the house than the original aluminum sliding cheapos. And my heating bill for that next winter was the same as it was the winter before, when PG&E was sending everybody a notice that says, if your heating bill has tripled, don't worry about it, we'll help you. We'll work with you to be able to pay it. Well, my heating bill did not triple, but a lot of people's did. And so when we are doing these standards, we need to be sensitive to fire danger, because we are in a high fire area. We need to be sensitive to costs for maintenance, for heating and cooling. We need to be effective energy efficiency for people, and those need to be part of those standards. So as you're going through doing these, I think that given what's happening with when you watch this old house and you see that this can be done and still maintain the look and feel of the historic building originally. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. And before the next speaker comes up, just if you're, I know there's been a few folks that have said if they'd like to be more involved still as this process goes on, if you could fill out one of the forms in the back, just with your name and your contact information, so we can keep you apprised of ongoing activities.
Hi, I'm going to be repeating a lot of what a lot of people have said, but I also live in a historic district. Again, we knew that the home was old when we bought it, but we didn't know it was historic. We didn't know it was in a historic district. We were a young married couple. We bought in 2009, when we could. I mean, the market had tanked. We were a single income family. I was at home with infant twins and a 6-year-old, you know. So just like Councilmember Cleese said, like, this is what we could afford at the time, and we didn't know what we were doing, you know. So the things that I'm thinking about, it's the same as the last speaker, is fire danger and efficiency. I'm not looking at like if it looks perfect, but we are more than willing to observe the historic features of our home. My husband's family has been here since the 1850s, and we love Placerville. He's grown up here, I've grown up here, we left and came back to raise our family. And we love the historic portion of Placerville, but in ways it's just not manageable, and that's the part I feel like is super important. So, and I will fill out a card because I want to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate your comments. Do we have any other public comments? All right, I will go ahead and close public comments and bring this back to the council and the planning commission for further discussion or questions. And it looks like Mr.
I have a question. An inventory was done before. Were photographs taken of all the buildings that were, you see, because one of the challenges, and of course I'm assuming that when the historic zones were created, they didn't go through and actually like take pictures of the buildings, because I agree we should update no one's going to say that we shouldn't update the inventory, but one of the challenges with the inventory is unless you have a reference for what the building looked like, what it was. Now that might be in the information that was part of that. You're not comparing apples and apples anymore. You're comparing apples and then 40-year-old apples, and so it could be a bit of a challenge. That having been said, I've said this, I support doing the inventory. We'll figure out how to fund it, blah, blah, blah. One of the things that I've always said about this town is that Placerville isn't Grass Valley, and it's not Nevada City, and it's not like a lot of other foothill towns. This is very much a working community. It has a lot of historical features to it, but it also has a lot going on. When the freeway was built, it was built in large part because Main Street used to be Highway 50. In fact, Main Street was Highway 50, Motherlode Drive was Highway 50, parts of Green Valley Road were Highway 50, and people will tell you that by the end of the 50s and the early 60s, my wife was born here, and her family's been here a long time. Trying to cross the highway was nearly impossible on certain times of the day during the week. The freeway was put where it was because they didn't want to build the bypass around the freeway through Pleasant Valley. Most of what you see in Placerville is because people thought it was progress. The freeway was progress. The freeway wasn't there to destroy something. It was there, A, to solve a traffic problem, and B, because that was the progress of the community. Ask Patty Borelli about Cumbelix. Cumbelix used to have a front on it. I don't know what it looked like before. But then the Cumbelix, sometimes in the 50s or 40s, whenever that was put on there, changed the front. And she said it was heartbreaking. She's told me this story a couple times, how it was heartbreaking. But the Cumbelix said, now we are more modern. And to them, changing the front of their building was actually progress. I'd like to not lose sight of the fact that that's what this town, to me, has always been. I've lived here 40 plus years, and it's always been changing. It protects itself. We've heard about the fact that the downtown should be a historic district, except for maybe the fact that Bluebell isn't there and the Cedar Room isn't there, and they built a building in there. They put the Fountain Plaza in there, and I think where the old used bookstore is different than it used to be, and there's some differences in the buildings downtown. The downtown looks pretty much the same. It hasn't changed. There haven't been these like wholesale destruction of places. I think the last important building to be torn down was the old Sites Brewery, and that was so Joe Stansel could build a parking lot, and that was bad. No one would argue with that. I would like to take a whole view of this subject. I think we do need to come up with some short-term solutions for the folks that actually want to do something with their homes, though. And that might not actually meld very well with the whole let's change our ordinance stuff, because that takes time. So I think maybe in very short order, we need to maybe think about doing that. And I don't even know how to do that. We'll let the planners tell us how to do that. But we can come up with some sort of rational way of dealing with what I've seen in your meetings, which would drive me nuts. Anyway, but most of this was done. The Pacific Street extension went right through the old Diamond Match site. And I imagine now we would be having a long, long discussion about changing the road because, well, the road didn't go there. You went down Pacific Street, you hit Sacramento, you took a right, and then if you wanted to go out, you had to turn a left on Main Street. I can't imagine what traffic would be like today if the Pacific Street extension hadn't been built back in, I think, either the late 80s or the early 90s, whenever that was done. Most of what's happened in town has happened for practical, important reasons. Some things bad have happened, but they're practical, important reasons, because we're still a working community, and we should never lose sight of that. Anyway, at least that's my humble opinion. Anyway.
Nathan, you had a...
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to address some of the questions about building materials, substitute building materials. What I've seen in other communities, Historic Preservation Commission meetings, is permit applicants bring in a sample of the material that they would like to use as a substitute, and then the preservation commissioners or the planning commissioners can compare the two, they can hold it and look at it and make a more informed decision, one that is, common sense, as opposed to trying to meet the published standards. So, and as the Planning Commission or Historic Preservation Commission in another city might, that's where the authority rests, not in the guidelines. So you might ask permit applicants to show you what they have in mind by actually bringing in a sample.
And we have done that in the past. I mean, I know, Michael, you've probably seen a lot of this more than any of us.
I wanted to address something that John mentioned about interim guidelines, and it sounds like maybe the City Council does want to eventually revisit the ordinance, but some working guidelines as an interim measure, and I was thinking that perhaps a community charrette or someone, I can't remember which member of the audience said a workshop where we take that public comment and then with your direction, develop those interim guidelines that clarify what we want to see in the current historic districts. All these other things are going to be moving forward. I have some questions about how extensive the inventory should be. I think that's another element to address in that RFP that goes out. But I just wanted to emphasize, I think that's important to get community input and develop those guidelines as soon as we can, as soon as practicable. And then if the city council decides to address the ordinance as a whole, that's a much longer term, much bigger project.
What I'm, of course, as chair, and I think speaking for my fellow commissioners, I think we're looking for what could we do quickly? Where's the low-hanging fruit? It seems to me that one of the messages I heard clearly tonight is there is flexibility, and I think we all need to take a breath and back off from our all or nothing positions and say, okay, there's always, and my view is always, well, there's a letter of the law and there's a spirit of the law. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to preserve, maintain our historic districts. We can get there, but we do not have to be so rigid in our application. I'm seeing members of the council kind of nod in that agreement, so I think what we will try to move forward, at least in the interim, with kind of that thinking in mind, and then look for other ways that we can be flexible and still achieve the same objective.
No, thank you, Michael. That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, I'm not so sure we need an interim, because I think you have that discretion. You are put on the planning commission for that purpose, to use your discretion and your best judgment. And I think that's kind of where we're at. I mean, from what we're hearing and from what we've discussed, is there's enough flexibility within the SOI to make a reasoned and findings on any given property. So I hate to change the rules on people and then come back a year later and say, well, then we're going to do these other rules. So let's use our discretion that we have. I think, we can have a further conversation, but I think there's some, at least there seems to be some agreement on that from what I'm hearing
I'm
from
really
people.
glad to hear that too. I just want to jump in. I think it's critical for the Planning Commission to make substantial findings when we do use that flexibility. And so we need to become very familiar with what the flexibility is, but clearly state in our decision what our findings are when we do decide to deviate from strict adherence.
Well, while we're all here tonight, I think we need to be able to give staff some direction on how we think, both as bodies. Are we all together in the thinking that we want to look at these other materials? One of the questions I had asked, regarding the historic buildings, it kind of sounds like there's all these levels, right? You're supposed to repair, you're supposed to, try to do all these things. And that's really going to fall upon those people to do what they want to do and try to do to stay on the National Historic District. But we have to decide as a city, are these alternative materials that have the same look, dual pane windows, is this all okay in a direction that we want to go to make it more practical and affordable, while still trying to retain that character? And so I think that's what we're both talking about, but I just want to be clear so that we can direct staff to move in that direction, because that's how I feel. It's time to relook at these. It's been 40+ years. It's time to relook at those standards, how we want to apply them in order to be consistent. We're trying to follow the SOI to the letter of the law, and I think what I'm hearing from everybody is we want to look at what's more practical for our citizens while still trying to maintain that character, but looking at what Grass Valley's doing and looking at some of our other options.
Could I follow up on that? I really appreciate you saying that, because I feel like that's what I want to get out of this is what our two priorities are right now prior to these changes that we're going to look at solidifying, clarifying, all of that. Are our priorities right now to maintain the inventory as it is? So for example, if a 1950s house comes before us and they want vinyl windows, but it looks the exact same, it's the double hump for double hump, things like that. As a council, are you open to that if it keeps the character and maintains the overall look of the historic homes? Same with other exterior changes that are same, energy efficient and fire efficient, which I think comes up a lot, at least, when we're considering something, changing materials. You guys are comfortable with us trying to maintain the inventory as it is while we work towards these higher level clarifying goals?
Right, I think that's the direction we're all talking about, recognizing that we're changing what we used to do and the way we used to look at it, you know.
For contributor homes, right? Contributor structures, right? For non-contributors, yes. Contributors we will take a little bit more exacting standard, right? I think,
Yeah, like
I heard that as well.
for example, like if I wanted to change my windows out, I'm gonna have to have a higher standard.
Hold him to a very high standard.
Yeah.
I wrote that down.
Yeah, so I would just kind of wanted to speak to that in terms of, I think contributing houses, we should sort of stick to that. And the folks that are already on the inventory, obviously we may want to update that. But if you're currently on the inventory, I would say you are a contributing house. And if you are not on the current inventory, then I think allowing more flexibility for things like fire safety, energy efficiency, as long as the appearance of the home itself from the street, you can't tell the difference. So the material is similar enough that it's not an obvious change. I guess that's where my kind of feeling as direction of where we're headed in the immediate kind of short term, while we figure out maybe making our own standards or updating our inventory list, and things along those lines. And also, I do think we should establish a period, because that came up frequently. I don't think necessarily we want to be preserving 1973 houses. So I think we need to say what our age range is in terms of the period we're actually trying to protect.
Having lived here and sold real estate at one time in my life, some of the houses that were built like in the 60s and 70s were pretty nondescript. I mean, it was like, they were lovely homes. But yeah, one thing I do want to say, and this, after watching your folks and listening to some of the folks out here, I have very little patience for people that want to beg forgiveness rather than permission. These folks that come rolling in and say, hey, the whole I didn't know. You live in California, for crimini's sake. You can't draw a breath without getting a permit. And this idea that you're going to do these reconstruction projects on your home and you don't think you need a permit, or and the contractors that are telling you not to get permits, I want to know who they are. Because every contractor that I've talked to, because I've done work on both of my homes, when I get a contractor, even when I do it myself, none of them have ever said, don't get a permit. Now, they'll sit there and say, would you go get the permit? Which I understand that. But I've never had that happen. So if there's people telling you that, I want to know who they are. But this thing where they come rolling in there and say, I didn't know, and I've done 3/4 of the project, no mercy. That's my humble opinion.
So
Nathan.
I've seen historic guidelines that cities have prepared for themselves where they include a section of contractors that have demonstrated they understand the Secretary of Interior standards or the guidelines that have been published by the city. And so it's a privilege to be on that list, and they can be called by homeowners to do the work and know what they're doing.
I actually like that. It's like kind of like a pre-qualified list almost of contractors. Yeah, I mean, I think the term tragedy of the commons comes up for me in the sense of you don't want to play to the lowest common denominator, because I mean, on one hand, if we don't do anything, I mean, because people will complain, and I think like Ruth brought this up, people will say, well, my neighbor didn't do it, and the 4 houses next to me didn't do it, and so I shouldn't have to do it either. Well, I agree. I don't think that's the reason to not have to do something. The reality is if we don't do enforcement, it just makes it worse. So we have to draw the line at some point. Otherwise, we will never have any standards whatsoever. So I don't think that's a good excuse, as John brought up. People get caught and then they beg for forgiveness or ignorance later. So we've heard that quite a bit. Yes. Yes, I saw Kirk. And Ryan hasn't spoken yet, I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, just a couple things real quick. I just, one thing that I really found interesting about Grass Valley's, the way they did their historic district guidelines is they have a rating system. and they're rated priority 1 through 4, and that gives them a lot of flexibility for homes that are inside these historic districts. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I think moving forward, it sounds like we have pretty much universal agreement on the fact that we do need to have different standards for different homes, non-contributing, contributing, but I really like this priority rating system. Everything from superb integrity to, that's priority 1, down to a home that has 0 integrity or is moderate infill. So we definitely need to make those determinations inside these historic districts, that it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's not a one size fits all. One other thing I wanted to bring up is that Mills Act, a city can be a Mills Act participant. It doesn't have to be the county. I went through all the paperwork this morning and yesterday. It can only benefit our residents. It's voluntary, it's positive, it gives them property tax protections. I would like to see direction to staff moving forward that we give our residents more opportunities to benefit from the restoration of their historic properties. It's here, it's available, and there's no reason why we can't participate in this program. And moving forward, possibly even with the certified local government designation. I know we've been talking about that at the Planning Commission a couple of times because of the grant situations. We'd really like to see some direction also in that from the city to try and get some of these programs available for our residents moving forward to encourage and to reward preservation of these historic homes. So it's not such a burden on them, and it actually encourages them to take advantage of these programs. So thank you.
I had a novel idea. It's that you follow resolution, 7896, which is you gave us, the Planning Commission, directives. It is, and I watched this body for 12 years, mostly on the other side. I would suggest you not throw the talent away. All of the issues that we look at on this subject come in the context of specific applications, not looking at the overall kinds of questions you've raised today. But several of us, at least 2 of us, proposed several months ago that we hold hearings on exactly these issues, that in the name of openness and transparency, that we hear from the public. But we get this kind of material when we just walk in here. It does refer to the Grass Valley standards. Commissioner Carter actually made a complete copy of all 154 pages. It does provide some insights. Why not let us try out this discussion and do what we talked about several months ago? But it got put off because let's wait until we have this joint meeting. But that's what your resolution says. It says that the Planning Commission shall advise the planning director. It also says we can advise the city council, but we haven't done that because of 2 reasons. Several reasons, but one of it is that we consider these issues only in the context of applications and instead of the general kind of thing that you're doing here. But the difference is this group has a lot of expertise, and I've seen them on both sides of the dais. They've got a lot of experience, and I think it would be wise to try it out, see what happens, both for modification of the present guidelines, because they are, as our professor said, guidelines. And there are ways we can make some standards that where people can follow those standards and expect some consistency. So that's my suggestion, is you follow the resolution you gave us 8 years ago. Thank you.
Kirk.
I wanted to make sure that we address the public's concern. There were more than one speaker mentioned the Historical Advisory Committee, and that is part of the responsibility of the Planning Commission now. And my question, I guess this kind of gets back to staff, is how we can do maybe a first level evaluation of a project as the Historical Advisory Committee without violating the Permitting Streamlining Act. I know that when, an application is complete, by law, the city has to move it forward and get it in front of the Planning Commission. So I just, that's a problem I want to make sure that we avoid. I'm not sure how many projects actually rise to the level that we need to, meet as a committee, but I wanted to make sure that the public understood that, that the city has various responsibilities, one of which is that Permit Streamlining Act adherence. And also back to the Mills Act, I don't know how hard that's going to be for the city to enroll in that, and it only applies, it's a property reduction, property tax reduction incentive to improve a house, but it only applies to the improvement that's done. So hopefully it would not, it's an incremental thing, so hopefully it would not impact, our revenues. And we certainly don't have that many houses that would, rise to the level, I think, that the improvement would even really be noticed as far as a revenue impact. So, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, just for a little historical perspective, I think I'm the only one here that was on Historical Advisory Commission, Planning Commission, and now City Council. And I know, I don't know, what am I thinking? I mean, the historical, it was difficult because I think we created, to your point, Chris, we created this extra layer where people had to go to us, but then it wasn't, ours was just advisory, and then it still had to go to Planning Commission, and then in some cases, if it didn't get solved there, then it got kicked to City Council. So it became a very long, laborious process. And what we also discovered as Historical Advisory Commission members in that iteration of it was that it ended up becoming a lot more work too, because then we'd have to go to Planning Commission to give our presentation as to why we made the decisions that we did, and then sometimes going to City Council as well if it continued on. So it ended up becoming, I think we were told it was going to be like 4 meetings a year when it first started, but then it just, part of it was our own fault because then we got more involved in things and we were looking at the historical district downtown, but it became, I think, a lot more work, and then people started dropping off.
Why did we disband it?
Disbanded because we had a lack of interest at the end. We couldn't get enough people to make quorum, and so it went away. Now, fast forward 8 years or whatever it is, there may very well be more interest again, and I know Councilman Clarici has brought up the idea of reviving it, but with a different, maybe more like a peak where we could kick ideas like this where they have more time to really work through, Kirk, what you're saying, and almost like a ad hoc to some, not an ad hoc because they'd have authority in a sense to go out and collect information. So
Maybe John could share it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, okay, thank you. Like everybody hasn't heard me enough tonight. My idea was to bring back the Historic Preservation Committee or historic, I don't know. But give it a broader scope because we tend to, one of the problem with this, the challenge with this conversation is all we talk about are the buildings. We talk about those buildings up there and the houses in the districts and all that, which is important because that's kind of the visual cue of our history. But sometimes we just don't talk about the history very much. And I was thinking more that they could be more part of kind of reclaiming and sort of getting the history together. If you read, I encourage all of you to read. I don't want to get into the hangings, but I encourage you to read the county's version of the hangings. I shared it with Kirk Smith, and it is like nothing I've ever read or seen or heard before about the hangings. I've heard several versions of it, and this one was like, whoa. I would like to be able to charge a handful of very interested people to go get us like the best version for us. And then we could all talk the closest version of it. And there's other things. There's a whole history of this town that goes after the gold rush, but it's almost like for a lot of folks and it's like it ended in 1857 or whenever the gold rush sort of ended. And then everything else is just like serpents and stuff and nobody talks about it. This town has an incredibly rich history, and I thought we could put together a group of people that would actually go do that. And then there's a bunch of other ideas I had in my head that I won't bore you with right now.
On the line of other ideas, we have the public art project going on.
Yes.
And I think, and I made a note that we can get historic preservation through our public art efforts as well. So that's another avenue, I think kind of speaks that that's not the only, Buildings aren't the only layer, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. That's kind of was my idea for the historic group, would be to venture out beyond that. Because we already got qualified people to deal with windows and decks and balustrades and nonsense like that.
Get back to Vice Mayor, who tried to keep us on task about coming to some direction for staff. So I guess what I want to do at this point is really give the floor to Pierre and Cleve to see. I know, and Cleve shaking his laughing, but you know, I know I've seen y'all taking lots of notes, and Pierre's been taking plenty of notes. But Pierre, it must, I guess it's unfortunately mostly to you, but I wanted to give you some chance, one, to give your thoughts, and two, if there's, if you want to ask us for some more specificity, so that we are going down a road and we're not just sort of leaving it for 6 months and we didn't really give you any good guidance. So
Well, staff is trying to get some cost estimates of what it would take to actually hire a professional consultant to do the inventory, just refresh the one that was done in 1984, 85. Because I think what I've heard is the importance of really being able to distinguish a contributor versus a non-contributor structure within a historic district. And then there's another aspect that I was, I should have gone to Planning Commissioner Smith earlier about this, because he raised an issue in some previous hearings. No, in fact, he didn't even raise it at the hearing. He brought it to me, and he was concerned about a particular property on Cedar Ravine that was obviously an historic house, but it had an historic retaining wall in front of it. It was dimension stone. It was probably quarried from the local area, and the wall failed. And instead of fixing this wall, because there is a quarry in the county where you can get similar stone to replace it, instead they took the whole wall out and put it in with keystone. And in my read of the Secretary of Interior standards is, not only sometimes do you look at the building, but you look at the whole property. Is there other historic features on that property that need to be looked at and protected? And we don't. Our ordinance is very, very restrictive to just a building on the site, and as some of the other speakers pointed out, just looking at the facade of the building that is in public view of a street. And so it is limiting. But I thought that was a really good point that was made. It's just something to throw out there. Maybe we can look at that if we go forward and select someone to do an inventory. But I think that inventory is very, very important. It was interesting, some of the comments made by Councilmember Clarici about about the problems that we have with contractors that do work without permit. And unfortunately, and this is something I've heard in my profession, I think we're trying to shape a culture where contractors don't get away with anything in the city of Placerville. And it's interesting too, because it seems like the focus was on the historic districts. Oh no, we have unpermitted work regardless of whether it's in a historic district or not. One thing staff is doing is, on the more egregious cases, we are taking it up with the state contractors licensing board and filing formal complaints. So it's not just that we want to go after the property owner who has maybe an unscrupulous contractor that's, that doesn't want to get a permit for whatever reason, or as I heard one of the speakers in the audience say, that he was told not to get a permit. Really, well, we also want to know who those contractors are, because we will make a formal complaint with the state. So with that, I guess one comment I want to make on the Historic Advisory Committee is, for staff's perspective, is an extremely time-consuming body to maintain. It's not so much as the Planning Commission, but it's close, because again, you're dealing with historic buildings and homeowners that have, a pocketbook. They're watching their budget. They have a different idea about historic preservation versus what the city, the staff, the commission, the council may desire. But I think you're looking at some budgetary impacts by imposing something like that. I would say that we're basically at a threshold where we couldn't take on something so large, and I would recommend that we would have to increase our staff if we're to then bring back yet another committee or advisory committee, because we already have, we have the council, we have the commission, we have peak. We have a lot on our plate, and so to take on something like that is quite substantial, because again, you're looking at more night meetings and the like. So that's my comment on that. And I think the Planning Commission is doing a very, very good job with handling, looking at these historic buildings. I was very impressed with the discussion we had at one more recent case. And I think what was necessary is, again, to hear from the council, give direction to staff, and then also to the Planning Commission is, what is the direction you want to have? I mean, staff, as I said at the very beginning when I was giving my staff reports, sometimes we feel like we're in the crosshairs between the property owner that has one idea and what our ordinance says and what we feel the commission wants or the council wants. And so clear direction and what flexibility we can have will help us, because it is staff that makes the initial evaluation and gives a recommendation to the Planning Commission that then may be making a recommendation to the council on appeal. So I guess those are my sort of general comments in a nutshell. If anybody has any more specific questions, I can certainly try and field them.
Thank you, Pierre. Yes.
So just so I'm kind of clear, our next steps are going to be, you're going to look into doing the inventory, getting the inventory updated?
Yes, we're going to start with trying to get a handle on what's the cost of doing that.
Okay.
Because we really don't have, I really personally don't have a handle on what that is. I hear a lot of figures that it could be $60,000 to $150,000 to do that. Because imagine you're going to have a professional looking at each of those buildings we have in our inventory. They're going to have to look at the house and determine whether or not the changes made over the last 40 years maybe moves the house from a contributor to a non-contributor.
Got you. Okay. Thank you. That's all.
I mean, the only other comment I'd have just generally on, because I also was like, wow, I really like Grass Valley. Like, this is cool stuff. And they do. They have, I give them a lot of credit. They've done a ton of work. Their website's really easy to use. It gives people some pretty clear guidance. However, you're talking about 1 square mile within the 1872 township. Ours would be like 5 times that, the way ours is laid out, and a lot more buildings to have to go through and do a 1 through 4 ranking, because they literally rank every single house within that township. So I don't know what they paid in 2010 dollars or 11, whenever they did it, but I can tell you in 2023 dollars to do that for our 4 historical districts, potentially downtown, would be well above $100,000 just for that. And that's not even talking about just our historical inventory.
Our guy here might have it.
I know the consultant that did the work in Placer County. He's great. He's recently retired, but he had a reputation for being affordable.
Affordable.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know.
If you can find that dollar figure, just FYI.
I could offer some low-hanging fruit going back to my earlier comment, and that
Yeah.
is just get something on the splash page, historic districts, and then just put a couple things there.
I agree.
I mean, that's an easy thing that we can do, right up front, and we can continue to build on as we go. So there's something I think
I agree, because I mean, it's
immediately actionable.
It's hard to even find the inventory. Yeah, you have to really search. You have to really search for it. Yeah. Cleve. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about, and then again, this goes back to Vice Mayor's position.
Did they get the direction they need?
Do you have the direction you need? And I mean, there's been talk about other like sessions, and again, we always look for that 5th Tuesday to do, things like this where we can have public forums and workshops. And again, it's come back to staff time and resources to have, another round of community input on these beyond tonight. I mean, is that feasible in addition to direction for this evening? I mean, I would love to have more community input. I mean, there's obviously not a ton of people here, but I also want to make sure that it's something that we can actually do, and not say we're going to do something and then not be able to fulfill it.
Yeah. On the issue of community input, though, and I mean, I guess everybody in Placerville has an interest in the history and the preservation of the history of this town, and even outside the city limits of this town. On the other hand, I want to hear from the folks that actually live in these places, because it's easy for someone that doesn't live in one of these places to go, yeah, they should go buy $5,000 windows. Why not? It's not my dime. And I think that I really want to hear from the folks that live in these districts and have, you said buy-in, and that's the buy-in. Well, and I'll tell you, just to get to a different subject, that's why there's not a historic district on Main Street right now, because they have never, you've been around long enough, and I've been around, you've been around long enough to know they could never get enough of the property owners out there to agree to it. And nobody's going to take that on unless you've got like 80% of those people that want to actually do it. Otherwise, you're buying a headache that you don't need, you don't want it, it just takes up staff time, and it wastes everybody's time because it's been tried before. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen, but you need to have buy-in, and I agree with that 100%. Buy-in from the folks that are living in these places, because, well, otherwise they don't do it, and then they go do stuff, and they don't get a contractor, and they don't get a permit.
So we do have a special subcommittee, a special committee on Planning Commission, Commissioner Smith, Commissioner Carter, specifically targeting historic components. And so I just whispered to Mr. Carter here, what I will ask the committee to do is to prepare a very succinct list of priorities of things that we can do, and perhaps immediate term, short term, long term things that we can then provide back to staff. I think one of the things we could do is set up, if it's a standing item on our planning commission meetings, there's always opportunities for members of the public then to come and speak to us and provide input there. So there's some things that we can do immediately. We have that avenue available to us.
So I think you guys kind of hit it, kind of the nail on the head with the buy-in part. You know, especially since we haven't redone the inventory since the 80s. So my question too with some of that is with the owners. I know in my neighborhood, because I do live in a historical district, there's a lot of apartment homes or buildings, okay, that are in the historic district. So how many of those are absentee owners? So where's the buy-in coming from that? Because I can tell you right now that a lot of them don't do a lot of the maintenance items or the upkeep items unless it is absolutely necessary to the point of, okay, my building's going to be condemned if I don't do this. So, and you can see it. I mean, that's part of it. I mean, some of the hard part is, we want to keep these districts looking good at the same time, because that's part of the process of, keeping a nice historical district. Well, if you've got these absentee owners and these things are so stringent and they're not buying in because they don't want to deal with the cost of it, well, we've lost right there.
You accomplished.
Right, we've accomplished nothing. So I think the biggest thing we need is definitely the inventory for staff direction. And then, of course, if somehow we can figure out how many absentee owners we do have with this kind of stuff that are in our historic districts, because that's going to be some of the big part of it there too. So.
I wanted to, I don't know how involved these absentee owners would be, but enrolling properties in the Mills Act, they get a reduction in their property taxes. So hopefully that would get their attention so that they do that necessary maintenance to keep their building from falling into disrepair. They get a little bit of property tax relief. So perhaps that'll, even someone who's not here full time might pay a little more attention to a building they have in one of our districts.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on that. With the industry that I'm in, with real estate and mortgages, I deal with a lot of investor clients. That property tax has got to make a big difference for them to really want to enroll themselves into something that's going to give them a higher standard to keep their building up. So, I mean, if they're getting a small percentage of just the improvement off, I don't know if that's going to be big enough for an investor to say, yeah, sure, I'll do this, and I will now dump a bunch more money into my property. So that's the other part. I think we're on the right track with the, figuring out the better materials, getting, better regulations out there that are more understandable and more cost effective. I think that's going to be a bigger help than just the tax reduction or getting them enrolled. I mean, getting them involved and getting them interested is definitely the direction we want to go, but I don't know if that's just, that's not going to be enough on its own.
No, not enough on its own, but maybe get their attention to do some needed maintenance. And I wanted to follow up on something John said about the downtown historic district. I really caught my attention. Dr. Holla mentioned that historic districts sometimes are created by the owners themselves. And, you said that it could happen. And, we've heard this many times. Why don't we have this historic district downtown? Well, I think what we learned tonight is that these districts oftentimes are created because of the impetus from the owners, so that if we did find ourselves in that situation where the owners got together and said, okay, we've got 80% of us do want that designation, and then they came before the city, it'd make it a lot easier for us to move forward. But for the city to impose it, top down, like you said, John, it would be a lot of work and a big headache.
Commissioner Smith, I was just going to ask for your thoughts on this. Yeah.
My father, as one of the opponents, that iconoclast was more of a libertarian / anarchist. So you cannot follow him. And it was the kind of generation that comes back from World War II, and it's Bill, baby Bill, the modern stuff. But here's what's really important. As Pierre pointed out, there was a workshop you did, a presentation about 4 years ago. There was one done 8 years ago that the city sponsored as well. They all said the same thing. This is a message you have to get out. It sounds strange, counterintuitive, but all the studies say, as our guest will tell you, that if you have historic districts, you have historic standards, and you have an enforcement mechanism, it doesn't mean draconian, but you have some kind of system, consistently what it does is it improves property values. Property values actually goes up. And in business districts, the value of sales tax goes up. I know it sounds strange, but that's what every one of the studies says, and it's the two workshops the city's had, one about 8 years ago and one 4 years ago. It would be helpful if the city got that message out there. The tapes are hard to hear, but just to clarify, I wouldn't.
I knew Kirk, I knew your father. Anyway, my guess is that and this is off topic a little bit, and we need to go home and eat, but my guess is that in some downtowns, but that might not be this is a robust downtown. I can't imagine the message that you would send to any of the property owners down there that says, you need to go do this other thing to fill your space. I mean, spaces don't stay empty very long on Main Street. They seem to be doing okay. And the question I have about this particular subject is, and it kind of even applies to the houses, is we have no faith in people, apparently. We think that the only way that they'll ever take care of a home and keep it in some sort of historic genre is if you provide them with all these guidelines and rules and regulations. Main Street hasn't had a historic district. Main Street is still cute as hell. Most of the storefronts look like they have for the last 40, 50, 60, you kind of go back in time to when they started doing some of the storefront improvements or changes like Sanitex and those places. It's still cute as a bug's ear. There isn't a single rule mandating anything on Main Street. And yet you go down to Main Street and you go, man, this is a nice place. So you'd have to convince the property owners, you actually, what's the benefit? And if all the storefronts were empty, I'd say, yeah, maybe you need to go do something, jazz it up. But Main Street looks pretty good right now. And we don't have a single rule. Doesn't mean there shouldn't be a historic district, but you're going to have to do some pretty serious tap dancing to convince people to do that.
Cleve, your thoughts on where we go next? I do like what Commissioner Friend said about what Planning Commission can do in the interim. I think that's great. However, I mean, just long term, what are
thank you. We've heard a lot of discussion. A lot of things have been, kind of kicked around. No definitive direction, I don't think. Well, on a few things, yes. But I think what I've heard is I think that Pierre and I can sit down and come up with a plan that we can present to the council to say, this is kind of the direction we could move forward. And I think we can include that some recommendations that might come from the Planning Commission, the committee that you've created, if they want to get some information to us. But I think there's some things that we can talk about and bring it back to the council very soon in terms of a direction we can move forward. Some of these things, like say the inventory process is going to be huge from what I'm hearing. And so that'll take some time, but we can come back to council first to say, do you want us to go figure out what it's gonna take to do this inventory? This example is one of the questions. Give us direction, yes, move forward with that and get those. I think there's other things that were in there. I will say that I think that you're gonna see us wanting to bring back perhaps some consulting time to look at maybe working through a subcommittee with the community that could look through all of these issues and bring back something that works. And I'll even throw this out. Maybe there's something that's a subcommittee that has a couple of council members, a couple of planning commissioners, and then community members that form this group that really dig into this and come up with some good ideas to go forward. So give us a couple of weeks here to put something together, and I think that Pierre and I can come back with some recommendations to go to the council, how we move forward, both how the council can do things and some things that the planning commission can do also.
Thank you, Cleve. That sound good to everybody? Sound good, everybody? Doctor, you have any closing comments from everything that you heard? Any other words of wisdom for us?
Well, one thing that occurred to me was, the folks in 1981 had a reason for creating these districts, and I think that there still needs to be a reason for the districts to exist. I don't think they should go away, but there should be a sense of purpose for a historic residential district. I mean, I've seen in some cities a historic district concept didn't work for the property owners, but a conservation district did, which governs not windows and siding, but just demolition. And so, and reconstruction. So there's other kinds of districts that are out there that I've seen that don't get involved in the nitty-gritty, but do protect a neighborhood from losing a property to demolition. So there's all kinds of flexibility out there, and but getting a sense of the buy-in from the property owners and why the historic district should exist, what it provides people, what just getting a sense of what the buy-in is would be wise, I think.
All right, thank you. All right, so with that, any last comments from anybody? Long overdue. I agreed. Agreed. All right. All right. Well, again, everybody that came out tonight, thank you very much for your comments. They were all very good and heartfelt and thoughtful. So the meeting is adjourned tonight. Thank you.